You've seen the headlines about Iran and Israel, but do you know the real story behind this conflict? This is more than just about nuclear programs or proxy wars, a relationship that was literally written in the Bible, with roots stretching back over 2 millennia. In this video, we're going to walk through the entire timeline: how ancient Persia actually helped establish the Jewish state, which biblical prophecies scholars believe are playing out today, why this conflict has deeper historical significance than any other Middle Eastern dispute, and what the ancient texts suggest might happen next. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a global community here. So without further ado, let's begin, shall we? A war older than time. Some conflicts echo through the ages. They begin in ancient texts and spill into modern headlines. The tension between ancient Persia and the land that would become the Jewish homeland carries this weight. Beyond politics and territory lies something deeper. More than a clash of nations, this stands as a story written in sacred pages thousands of years before satellites tracked missiles or diplomats signed treaties. The ancient world knew this pattern. Empires rise against chosen peoples. Kings plot in palace chambers while prophets receive visions of distant wars. These moments stretch across centuries, connecting Abraham's covenant to Daniel's dreams, linking Esther's courage to Revelation's final chapters. Therefore, what we witness today emerges from roots planted in Scripture itself. Genesis speaks of nations blessed and cursed according to their treatment of Abraham's descendants. Deuteronomy warns of scattering and regathering. The prophets describe armies gathering from distant lands against a restored people. Each verse builds towards something larger. Each prophecy points to battles fought not just with swords and shields, but in the realm where spiritual forces shape earthly events. Babylon conquered Jerusalem, but Persia would rebuild it. Rome scattered the Jewish people, but divine promises remained intact. Through every exile and return, through every persecution and deliverance, the ancient words held firm. They spoke of temporary defeats and ultimate victory. They described faithful remnants preserved through impossible odds. The Eastern kingdoms played their roles in this unfolding drama, sometimes as instruments of judgment, sometimes as tools of restoration. Cyrus the Great received honor in Isaiah's pages for purposes he likely never understood. Haman plotted genocide while Providence prepared Esther for such a time as that. These patterns repeat because the author remains constant. Modern news carries echoes of ancient conflicts. Threats against the Jewish people surface again. Eastern powers gather strength while Western allies pledge protection. Nuclear weapons replace bronze shields, but the spiritual dimensions remain unchanged. The war was written before the weapons were forged. Scripture presents this conflict through prophetic lenses that span millennia. Daniel saw empires represented as beasts rising from the sea. Ezekiel described armies gathering from the north for a final assault. Revelation reveals kings from the east crossing dried rivers toward ultimate battle. These visions connect across testaments, linking ancient Persia to end-time events. Understanding requires looking beyond surface politics to deeper spiritual realities. Nations serve purposes larger than their leaders imagine. Armies march according to divine timetables their generals cannot see. The conflict between ancient Persia and the covenant people unfolds within God's sovereign plan, where even opposition advances his purposes. This war began with promises made to Abraham in Canaan. It continues through prophecies given to Daniel in Babylon. It approaches fulfillment in visions shown to John on Patmos. From Genesis to Revelation, the storyline remains consistent. The people of promise will face testing from Eastern powers, but their ultimate preservation stands guaranteed by divine covenant. Therefore, understanding this conflict requires both historical knowledge and prophetic insight. Ancient texts illuminate modern tensions. Scriptural warnings prepare hearts for difficult seasons. The war was indeed written in the Bible, and its outcome was determined before the first battle began. Persia's golden hour, a friend to the chosen people. Ancient Persia entered biblical history as an unlikely instrument of mercy. While Babylon had brought destruction and exile, this Eastern empire would become the agent of restoration. The transformation seems almost impossible. One moment, God's people wept by Babylon's rivers. The next, a Persian king was issuing decrees for their return home. Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, and everything changed. The conqueror, who expanded his empire from India to the Mediterranean, chose an unusual policy toward captive peoples. Rather than destroying their cultures, he restored their homelands. Rather than silencing their gods, he rebuilt their temples. This approach would reshape the ancient Near East and fulfill prophecies spoken generations earlier. Isaiah had called Cyrus the Lord's anointed 2 centuries before his birth. The prophet used the Hebrew word Mashiach, the same term later translated as Messiah. Here stood a pagan king receiving a title reserved for kings of the covenant people. The implications staggered the mind. God was working through foreign rulers to accomplish his purposes for his chosen nation. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in modern times, confirms the biblical account. This ancient document records the king's policy of returning exiled peoples to their homelands and restoring their religious practices. Archaeological evidence validates what Scripture had proclaimed. Cyrus genuinely believed the gods of conquered peoples had granted him victory, and he honored them accordingly. Ezra records the specific decree that changed everything. Cyrus commanded that the temple in Jerusalem be rebuilt at royal expense. Gold and silver vessels taken by Nebuchadnezzar were returned. Provisions were made for ongoing sacrifices. The Persian treasury would fund what the Babylonian army had destroyed. Divine irony transformed enemy plunder into building materials for restoration. More than political calculation drove these decisions. Cyrus seemed genuinely convinced that Israel's God had raised him to power for this purpose. The book of Ezra quotes him declaring that the Lord God of heaven had given him all earthly kingdoms and charged him to build a house in Jerusalem. A pagan king was acknowledging the sovereignty of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Persian policy toward the Jewish people remained consistently favorable for 2 centuries. Darius confirmed Cyrus's decree when opposition arose. Artaxerxes commissioned both Ezra and Nehemiah for their respective missions. Each Persian ruler honored the commitments made by his predecessors. The empire that followed Babylon chose blessing over cursing when dealing with the covenant people. The results vindicated this approach. Under Persian protection, the temple was rebuilt and consecrated. The walls of Jerusalem rose again. The law was restored and taught. A faithful remnant returned from exile and reestablished covenant worship. The foundation was laid for the Judaism that would produce the Messiah centuries later. Daniel prospered under both Babylonian and Persian rule, but found his greatest honor in the Persian court. His visions of future empires came during this period. The Eastern kingdom that succeeded Babylon received prophetic insight about coming ages. God revealed his plans to the very empire he was using to restore his people. Even Esther's story unfolds within this framework of Persian favor. Though Haman arose with murderous intent, the system that elevated Esther to queen and gave Mordecai authority remained fundamentally friendly to Jewish interests. The Persian court became the stage where God's protection of his people was dramatically displayed. Therefore, when modern tensions arise between present-day Persia and the Jewish state, historical perspective provides important context. Ancient Persia served as God's instrument for restoration. The Persian Empire enabled the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the Temple. These foundations made possible the Judaism into which the Messiah was born. Persian gold funded the altar where sacrifices pointed toward Calvary. This golden hour of Persian-Jewish cooperation lasted from Cyrus to Alexander. For 2 centuries, the Eastern Empire consistently blessed rather than cursed the people of promise. The precedent was established in Scripture itself. Persia could serve divine purposes when her rulers aligned with heaven's agenda rather than opposing it. Shadows in the palace, Esther, Haman, and the birth of anti-Semitism. In the heart of the Persian Empire, during the reign of King Ahasuerus, a darkness stirred that would echo through millennia. The palace at Susa became the stage where spiritual forces engaged in cosmic conflict. Beyond the political maneuvering and court intrigue lay something more sinister. An ancient hatred was taking shape, one that would resurface in different forms throughout history. Haman the Agagite entered the biblical narrative carrying more than personal ambition. His genealogy connected him to Agag, the Amalekite king, whom Saul had spared but Samuel later destroyed. The Amalekites held special significance in Hebrew memory. They had attacked the Israelites from behind during the Exodus, targeting the weak and vulnerable. Moses declared that the Lord would have war with Amalek from generation to generation. This historical enmity provided context for what unfolded in Susa. Haman's hatred of Mordecai went beyond wounded pride when the Jewish official refused to bow. Something deeper was at work. The descendant of Agag faced the descendant of Benjamin. Ancient tribal conflicts were playing out in a Persian palace, but the stakes had grown far larger. Haman's plot revealed the first systematic attempt at what would later be called genocide. He convinced Ahasuerus to issue a decree calling for the destruction of all Jews throughout the empire in one day. The language was comprehensive and chilling. Young and old, women and children, all were to be eliminated. Their property was to be plundered. Their very memory was to be erased. The casting of lots, Purim in Hebrew, gave this attempt at annihilation its name. Haman sought divine approval for his timing, using methods common in ancient Near Eastern decision-making. But the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob overruled whatever spiritual forces Haman consulted. The lots fell according to a higher sovereignty than Haman understood. Mordecai's response demonstrated the theological understanding that guided Jewish survival. He told Esther that if she remains silent, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. His confidence rested not in human schemes, but in divine faithfulness. The promises made to Abraham guaranteed that his descendants would endure despite every attempt to destroy them. Esther's courage in approaching the king uninvited reflected more than patriotic duty. She was risking her life for her people, embodying the biblical principle that those blessed with influence bear responsibility for those who suffer. Her 3-day fast prepared her spiritually for a task that would determine the survival of the Jewish people in the ancient world. The reversal that followed demonstrated divine justice in operation. Haman was hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. The Jews were authorized to defend themselves against their enemies. Those who had hoped to plunder Jewish property were themselves destroyed. The would-be victims became victorious, and their enemies experienced the fate they had planned for others. But the most significant aspect of this account lies in the spiritual pattern it established. Haman embodied a type of enmity that would appear repeatedly throughout history. His hatred was not merely political or ethnic, but spiritual in nature. He saw in the Jewish people something that offended his very being: their refusal to assimilate, their distinct identity, their covenant relationship with the God of heaven. All of this provoked a rage that could only be satisfied by their complete destruction. This same spirit would animate Pharaoh's persecution in Egypt, Antiochus Epiphanes' attempts to Hellenize Judea, and Roman efforts to end Jewish national existence. It would later possess medieval Christians who expelled Jews from their lands, Spanish inquisitors who forced conversions, and European fascists who implemented their final solution. The pattern persists because the underlying spiritual conflict remains unchanged. The people who carry God's covenant promises face opposition from forces that cannot tolerate their existence. Their survival testifies to divine faithfulness in ways that expose the emptiness of false gods and failed systems. Therefore, they must be silenced or destroyed. Esther's triumph established the Feast of Purim as an annual celebration of God's protective providence. Jewish families still gather to read the Megillah and remember how mourning was turned to joy, how sorrow became gladness. They recall that when powerful enemies plot their destruction, the God of heaven has already prepared their deliverance. The relevance to modern tensions becomes clear when similar language appears in contemporary declarations. When leaders speak of wiping nations off the map or eliminating Jewish presence in ancient homelands, they echo Haman's ancient rhetoric. The same spiritual hatred that possessed the Agagite continues to seek expression through willing human agents. Therefore, understanding the Iran-Israel conflict requires recognizing its spiritual dimensions. Beyond geopolitical considerations and regional power struggles lies the age-old enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Haman's shadow still falls across the Middle East, seeking new embodiments for his ancient hatred. The ram and the goat, Daniel's vision of empires. In the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, Daniel received a vision that would illuminate centuries of future history. Standing by the Ulai Canal in Susa, the aged prophet witnessed symbolic conflicts that revealed the rise and fall of empires yet to come. The images were both vivid and mysterious, requiring divine interpretation to unlock their meaning for both ancient and modern times. A ram appeared first, powerful and proud, with two horns of unequal height. The longer horn grew up later than the shorter one. This mighty creature charged westward, northward, and southward with irresistible force. No beast could stand before it. The ram grew exceedingly great, doing as it pleased across the known world. Gabriel later explained that the ram represented the Medo-Persian Empire. The two horns symbolized the dual nature of this kingdom, with Persia eventually dominating over the Medes. The ram's conquests in three directions matched the historical expansion of Persian power under Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius. From India to Ethiopia, from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush, Persian armies had indeed charged forth with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Daniel's vision then shifted to an even more dramatic scene. A male goat came from the west, moving across the earth without touching the ground. This creature bore a prominent horn between its eyes and struck the ram with furious force. The collision shattered both of the ram's horns, trampling the fallen beast underfoot. The goat's victory was swift and complete. Gabriel identified the goat as the Greek Empire, with its prominent horn representing the first king, Alexander the Great. History validates this interpretation with stunning precision. Alexander's armies moved with legendary speed, covering vast distances in minimal time. His victories over Persian forces at the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela systematically dismantled the empire that had ruled the ancient world for 2 centuries. The vision continued with the goat's great horn being broken at the height of its power, replaced by 4 notable horns growing toward the 4 winds of heaven. This corresponded to Alexander's death at 33 and the division of his empire among his 4 generals. Cassander took Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus controlled Thrace and Western Asia Minor, Seleucus ruled Syria and the Eastern Territories, while Ptolemy governed Egypt and adjacent regions. From one of these divisions, Daniel saw a little horn emerge that grew exceedingly great toward the south, east, and the beautiful land. This horn exalted itself against the host of heaven, casting down some of the stars and trampling them underfoot. It challenged the prince of the host, removing the daily sacrifice and casting down the place of his sanctuary. Most biblical scholars identify this little horn with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid ruler who persecuted the Jewish people around 167 to 164 BCE. His attempts to Hellenize Judea, his desecration of the temple, and his prohibition of Jewish religious practices match the vision's description. The successful Maccabean revolt that followed corresponded to the horn's ultimate defeat. However, the vision's language suggests layers of meaning that extend beyond historical Antiochus. The prophetic pattern established in Daniel's time would repeat in various forms throughout history. The little horn represents a recurring type, rulers who oppose God's people and seek to destroy their covenant relationship with heaven. The numeric references in the vision add another dimension of complexity. The 2,300 evenings and mornings until the sanctuary would be cleansed could refer to the historical period of temple desecration under Antiochus. But prophetic time often operates on multiple levels, potentially pointing to longer periods or end-time fulfillments yet to come. Daniel's emotional response to the vision reveals its profound impact. He was overcome with weakness and lay sick for days. The implications of what he had seen, the rise and fall of mighty empires, the persecution of God's people, the desecration of holy things, created physical distress in the faithful prophet. The vision established prophetic principles that illuminate later biblical prophecy. Empires that seem invincible eventually fall to successor powers. Rulers who oppose heaven's agenda face divine judgment. God's people endure persecution but experience ultimate vindication. The sanctuary may be defiled temporarily, but will be cleansed and restored. These patterns continued beyond the Greek period into Roman times and subsequent history. Various rulers have embodied aspects of the little horn's character, opposing God's covenant people, exalting themselves against divine authority, seeking to destroy distinctive Jewish identity and worship. Contemporary applications require careful consideration of the vision's multi layered nature. While Antiochus provided the primary historical fulfillment, the prophetic template he established could manifest again in end time scenarios. Rulers in the Middle East who seek to eliminate Jewish presence in the land of promise may be unconsciously following the little horn pattern. The vision's geographical references also merit attention. The little horn's expansion toward the south, east, and beautiful land corresponds to directions from the Seleucid base in Syria, but these same directions could apply to other powers that threaten the covenant people from similar geographic positions. Therefore, Daniel's vision of the ram and goat provides both historical insight and prophetic warning. It demonstrates God's sovereign control over the rise and fall of empires while revealing the recurring pattern of opposition that his people will face. The vision reminds us that earthly powers, no matter how mighty, operate within divine parameters and ultimately serve heaven's eternal purposes. From Persia to Islam, the long transformation. The Persia that blessed the Jewish people under Cyrus underwent a spiritual transformation that would reshape the entire Middle East. This change unfolded slowly across centuries, involving conquest, conversion, and theological evolution. Understanding this process illuminates how the empire that once funded Jerusalem's rebuilding became the heart of a civilization often at odds with Jewish interests. Alexander's conquest in 331 BCE marked the beginning of Persia's long journey away from Zoroastrian traditions toward eventual Islamic faith. Greek influence introduced Hellenistic ideas and weakened traditional Persian religious structures. When the Sassanid dynasty later revived Persian independence, they attempted to restore Zoroastrianism, but faced increasing challenges from emerging monotheistic faiths, particularly Christianity and Manichaeism. The decisive moment came in 636 CE at the Battle of Qadisiyah. Arab Muslim armies defeated the Sassanid forces, beginning the Islamic conquest of Persia. Unlike previous invasions, this conquest brought not just new rulers, but an entirely new religious and cultural framework. The Persian Empire, which had endured for over a millennium, was about to undergo its most fundamental transformation. The process of conversion to Islam occurred gradually over several centuries. Persian Zoroastrian nobles initially retained power by converting to Islam while maintaining their administrative roles. The Arabic language became the tongue of government and scholarship, though Persian literary traditions eventually re-emerged in Islamic forms. Persian cultural elements blended with Islamic theology to create unique expressions of the faith. During the early Islamic period, Persia contributed significantly to Islamic civilization. Persian administrators helped build the Abbasid Caliphate's governmental structure. Persian scholars translated Greek philosophical works into Arabic, preserving classical knowledge for later transmission to Europe. Cities like Baghdad and Isfahan became centers of Islamic learning, where Persian intellectual traditions merged with Islamic theology. However, the most crucial development for future Iran-Israel relations emerged during the Safavid period in the early 16th century. Shah Ismail first declared Twelver Shia Islam the official religion of Persia, distinguishing his empire from the Ottoman Sunni Caliphate to the west. This decision would have profound theological and political consequences that continue to influence Middle Eastern dynamics. Shia Islam developed distinct characteristics that shaped Persian Muslim attitudes toward various issues, including Jewish populations and the land of Israel. The doctrine of the hidden Imam taught that the 12th Imam had gone into occultation and would return as the Mahdi to establish perfect justice on earth. This created an apocalyptic worldview that influenced Persian Shia approaches to contemporary events. The concept of wilayat al-faqih, or guardianship of the jurist, gave religious scholars unprecedented political authority in Shia societies. Unlike Sunni Islam, where religious and political authority were generally separated, Shia doctrine provided theological justification for clerical rule. This principle would later become central to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Shia theology also developed distinctive views regarding the legitimacy of existing political orders. The doctrine held that all governments prior to the Mahdi's return were inherently illegitimate, though some might be more tolerable than others. This created a revolutionary potential within Shia political thought that could be activated under certain circumstances. Persian Shia attitudes toward Jewish populations evolved within this theological framework. While early Islamic law had established dhimmi status for people of the book, Shia interpretations sometimes added additional restrictions. The concept of ritual impurity was applied more strictly to non-Muslims in some Shia regions, affecting Jewish community life in ways not always present in Sunni areas. The relationship between Persian rulers and Jewish subjects varied considerably across different dynasties. Some Safavid and Qajar rulers protected Jewish communities and utilized Jewish merchants and physicians. Others imposed harsh restrictions or forced conversions. These fluctuations reflected broader patterns of tolerance and persecution that characterized Middle Eastern Jewish experience under Islamic rule. By the 19th century, Persian Shia identity had become deeply embedded in the region's cultural and religious consciousness. The annual commemoration of Hussein's martyrdom at Karbala reinforced themes of righteous suffering and resistance against illegitimate authority. These narratives provided emotional and theological resources that could be mobilized against perceived enemies of the faith. European colonial influence in the 19th and early 20th centuries created additional tensions within Persian society. The Qajar dynasty's weakness in the face of British and Russian pressure generated nationalist resentment that would later fuel revolutionary movements. The discovery of oil added economic dimensions to these tensions while increasing foreign involvement in Persian affairs. When the Pahlavi dynasty attempted rapid westernization in the 20th century, it created a backlash among traditional Shia clerics who viewed these changes as threats to Islamic values. The exile of Ayatollah Khomeini in 1963 marked a turning point in the relationship between the monarchy and the religious establishment. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 represented the culmination of these long-developing tensions. Khomeini's vision combined traditional Shia theology with modern revolutionary ideology, creating a new form of Islamic government that claimed legitimacy through religious rather than secular sources. This fusion of ancient Persian pride with revolutionary Shia Islam would profoundly affect Iran's foreign policy. Therefore, the transformation from ancient Persia to modern Iran involved more than simple religious conversion. It included the gradual development of a distinct Shia identity that emphasized clerical authority, apocalyptic expectations, and resistance to perceived oppression. These elements would shape Iranian attitudes toward regional issues, including the eventual conflict with the restored Jewish state. Islam's view of the covenant people, inheritance and replacement. The relationship between Islam and the Jewish people begins with recognition and transforms into rivalry. Early Islamic texts acknowledge the special status of Jews as people of the book, while later developing theological frameworks that challenge Jewish claims to covenant relationship with God. Understanding this evolution provides crucial context for comprehending modern Middle Eastern tensions. The Quran initially presents Jews in relatively positive terms. The early Meccan surahs speak respectfully of Moses and the children of Israel. The text acknowledges that God chose the Israelites above all nations and gave them the Torah as guidance. These passages recognize legitimate Jewish claims to divine revelation and special relationship with the Almighty. However, as Muhammad's message developed in Medina, the Quranic tone regarding Jews became increasingly critical. The text began emphasizing Jewish rejection of subsequent prophets and failure to maintain covenant faithfulness. Stories of the golden calf, rebellion in the wilderness, and resistance to prophetic messages highlighted Jewish shortcomings rather than Jewish chosenness. The concept of Nasikh emerged as Islamic theology matured, teaching that later revelations could abrogate earlier ones. This principle allowed Muslim scholars to argue that while Jews had once held a special covenant relationship with God, Islam had now superseded and replaced that relationship. The final revelation through Muhammad was seen as correcting and completing earlier scriptural traditions. Islamic replacement theology developed several key arguments. First, it claimed that Jews had corrupted their scriptures through a process called tahrif, either by altering the text itself or misinterpreting its meaning. This alleged corruption explained why Jewish scriptures seemed to differ from Quranic teachings on certain points. Second, Islamic theology argued that many biblical prophecies actually pointed to Muhammad rather than to figures within Jewish tradition. The promised prophet, like Moses, mentioned in Deuteronomy 18, various messianic passages, and references to Ishmael's blessing were all interpreted as predictions of the Arabian prophet's coming. Third, the doctrine taught that Abraham was neither Jew nor Christian, but a pure monotheist, a Hanif, whose true spiritual descendants were those who followed Muhammad's message. This redefined the Abrahamic covenant in ways that favored Islamic claims while diminishing Jewish ones. The development of Islamic law further complicated Jewish status within Muslim societies. While the Quran granted Jews protection as dhimmis, the practical implementation of this status often included significant restrictions. Jews could practice their religion, but could not build new synagogues, could not proselytize, had to pay special taxes, and were subject to various social limitations. These legal frameworks varied considerably across different Islamic societies and time periods. The Umayyad and early Abbasid periods generally showed more tolerance, while later dynasties sometimes imposed harsher restrictions. The actual treatment of Jewish populations depended heavily on local conditions, ruler preferences, and prevailing social attitudes. Medieval Islamic scholars developed increasingly sophisticated arguments for why Islam had replaced Judaism as God's chosen community. Al-Ghazali, Averroes, and other prominent theologians wrote extensively about the supersession of earlier revelations by the final message of Islam. These intellectual frameworks provided theological justification for viewing Jews as a people whose time of special favor had ended. The concept of ummah became central to Islamic self-understanding in ways that paralleled but challenged Jewish ideas of chosenness. Muslims saw themselves as the final and perfect community chosen by God to carry his message to all humanity. This chosen status was understood to have transferred from earlier communities, including the Jews who had failed to maintain their covenant faithfulness. Eschatological expectations within Islam often portrayed Jews in negative roles during end-time events. Various traditions spoke of final conflicts between Muslims and Jews before the Day of Judgment. These prophecies, while not universally accepted, provided scriptural support for those who viewed Jews as ultimate enemies of Islamic faith. The issue of land added another dimension to theological tensions. While early Islamic law had generally recognized existing property rights, the rapid expansion of Islamic territory raised questions about the status of formerly non-Muslim lands. Some interpretations suggested that lands once under Islamic rule could never legitimately be ruled by non-Muslims again. These theological developments had practical consequences for Jewish communities throughout the Islamic world. While Jews often experienced better treatment under Islamic rule than under Christian rule during the medieval period, their status remained fundamentally dependent on Muslim tolerance and protection rather than inherent rights. The relationship between Islamic theology and Jewish claims became particularly complex regarding the land of Israel. Early Islamic sources had acknowledged Jewish historical connection to the land, while claiming that Muslim conquest had transferred ownership to the Islamic community. Later interpretations sometimes denied Jewish historical claims altogether. Sufi mystical traditions within Islam occasionally developed more positive views of Jewish spirituality, recognizing commonalities between Islamic and Jewish mystical practices. However, these minority viewpoints had limited influence on mainstream Islamic attitudes toward Jewish communities and their religious claims. Modern Islamic movements have often revived and intensified these classical theological arguments. Contemporary Muslim scholars and political leaders frequently cite medieval Islamic texts to support arguments against Jewish presence in traditional Islamic lands or to challenge Jewish religious claims. The establishment of Israel in 1948 activated many dormant theological tensions within Islamic thought. The return of Jewish political sovereignty to a land Muslims had ruled for over a millennium raised fundamental questions about divine favor and prophetic fulfillment that Islamic theology was not well prepared to address. Therefore, understanding Islamic replacement theology provides essential context for comprehending modern Middle Eastern conflicts. The theological framework that developed over centuries of Islamic thought created intellectual and spiritual obstacles to accepting Jewish national restoration that persist in contemporary discussions. The Safavids, Shi'ism, becomes state religion. In 1501, a teenager named Ismail conquered the city of Tabriz and declared himself Shah of Persia. More significantly, he proclaimed Twelver Shia Islam as the official religion of his realm. This decision would transform not only Persia but the entire geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. The Safavid Revolution created the foundation for modern Iranian identity and established patterns of religious authority that continue to influence regional conflicts. Shah Ismail's conversion of Persia to Shia Islam was neither gradual nor voluntary. The young ruler imposed the new faith with remarkable speed and considerable force. Sunni mosques were converted to Shia use. Sunni clerics were expelled or forced to convert. The traditional call to prayer was modified to include distinctly Shia elements. Within a few decades, a predominantly Sunni population had become officially Shia. The transformation required importing Shia clerics from Lebanon, Bahrain, and other regions where Twelver traditions had survived. These scholars brought with them sophisticated theological frameworks that had developed over centuries in minority contexts. Now they found themselves tasked with creating institutions for a majority Shia state, something unprecedented in Islamic history. The Safavid establishment of Shia orthodoxy created immediate tensions with neighboring Sunni powers. The Ottoman Empire viewed the new Persian state as both a political rival and a religious threat. Ottoman Safavid wars became expressions of the Sunni-Shia divide that had originated in 7th century succession disputes, but now acquired fresh political relevance. Twelver Shia theology brought distinctive elements to Persian religious culture. The doctrine of the hidden imam taught that Muhammad al-Mahdi, the 12th descendant of Ali, had gone into occultation in 874 CE and would return to establish perfect justice on earth. This created a messianic expectation that would profoundly influence Persian political thought. During the imam's absence, religious authority theoretically belonged to the community of believers. However, Safavid rulers claimed divine sanction for their rule while elevating certain clerics to positions of unprecedented influence. This created a complex relationship between political and religious authority that would evolve over subsequent centuries. The concept of ijtihad, independent reasoning in religious matters, gained new prominence under Safavid rule. Unlike Sunni Islam, which had generally closed the door to ijtihad centuries earlier, Shia theology maintained that qualified scholars could continue interpreting religious law. This kept Shia legal tradition more dynamic, but also created potential for conflict between different clerical authorities. Safavid religious policies had particular implications for non-Muslim minorities. Jewish communities in Persia faced increased restrictions as the new regime sought to demonstrate its Islamic credentials. The concept of najis, ritual impurity, was applied more strictly to non-Muslims than had been common under previous dynasties. The shrine cities of Mashhad, Qom, and Isfahan became centers of Shia learning under Safavid patronage. These institutions developed sophisticated curricula that emphasized both traditional Islamic sciences and distinctively Shia theological perspectives. Students came from across the Shia world to study in these academies, creating networks that would prove politically significant in later centuries. Safavid economic policies were closely linked to their religious agenda. The state controlled major trade routes and used commercial revenues to fund religious institutions. Waqf endowments supported clerical education and social services. This created a religious establishment with significant economic resources and political influence. The development of Persian Shia identity under the Safavids included strong messianic and apocalyptic elements. Popular religion emphasized the coming return of the hidden imam, who would bring justice and defeat the enemies of true Islam. These expectations could be mobilized for political purposes when circumstances warranted. Safavid art and architecture reflected the new religious orientation while maintaining distinctively Persian cultural elements. Mosque decorations incorporated Shia themes alongside traditional Persian motifs. Calligraphy featured the names of the 12 imams. Poetry celebrated both Persian heritage and Shia devotion. The institution of Taziyeh, passion plays commemorating the martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala, became central to Persian Shia culture under Safavid rule. These dramatic presentations reinforced themes of righteous suffering and resistance to illegitimate authority. The annual Ashura observances created powerful emotional bonds among the Shia community. By the end of the Safavid period in the early 18th century, Persia had been thoroughly transformed. What had begun as a political conquest had become a comprehensive religious and cultural revolution. Shia Islam was no longer a minority faith seeking accommodation with Sunni rulers, but the established religion of a major regional power. The clerical establishment that emerged under Safavid rule possessed both religious authority and political influence. While individual rulers might limit clerical power, the institutional framework created by the Safavids provided resources for religious leaders to maintain their position and influence over Persian society. The Safavid legacy created templates for later Iranian political development. The idea that religious and political authority should be closely linked, the expectation that the state should enforce religious orthodoxy, and the belief that Persia had a special role in Shia Islam all became permanent features of Iranian political culture. When political upheavals occurred in later centuries, these Safavid-era frameworks provided ready-made alternatives to secular governance. The 1979 Iranian Revolution would draw heavily on institutional and ideological precedents established during the Safavid transformation of Persia into a distinctively Shia state. Therefore, understanding the Safavid establishment of Shia Islam as Persia's state religion illuminates the deep historical roots of contemporary Iranian political culture. The patterns of religious authority, messianic expectation, and state-sponsored orthodoxy created during this period continue to influence Iranian approaches to both domestic governance and regional relationships. A land reborn, Zionism, Aliyah, and the prophetic clock. For 18 centuries, the Jewish people lived as scattered exiles, carrying in their hearts the memory of Jerusalem and the hope of return. Then, in the late 19th century, something extraordinary began to stir. A movement emerged that would transform both Jewish destiny and Middle Eastern reality. Zionism arose not merely as political ideology, but as the fulfillment of ancient promises that many believed could never be realized. The movement's foundations were laid in Eastern European Jewish communities where persecution had intensified dramatically. The 1881 pogroms in Russia shattered any illusions that assimilation could provide security. As violence spread and legal restrictions tightened, many Jews concluded that safety required their own homeland rather than dependence on Gentile tolerance. Theodor Herzl crystallized these yearnings into organized political action. His pamphlet, The Jewish State, argued that anti-Semitism was permanent and universal, making Jewish national independence both necessary and inevitable. The first Zionist Congress in Basel established formal institutions to work toward this goal, creating structures that would eventually achieve statehood. However, Zionism was more than political calculation. Many of its early supporters saw connections to biblical prophecy that gave the movement spiritual significance beyond practical considerations. The vision of dry bones coming together and breathing again, described in Ezekiel 37, seemed to find literal fulfillment as scattered Jewish communities began returning to their ancient homeland. The first Aliyah began in 1882, bringing approximately 35,000 Jews to Ottoman Palestine over 2 decades. These pioneers faced enormous hardships: malaria, poverty, hostile neighbors, and bureaucratic obstacles. Yet they persevered, establishing agricultural settlements that would become the foundation for future Jewish independence. The second Aliyah, from 1904 to 1914, brought different motivations and methods. These immigrants were often secular socialists who saw in Palestine an opportunity to create new forms of Jewish society. They established kibbutzim and developed Hebrew as a living language rather than merely liturgical tongue. Tel Aviv was founded in 1909 as the first modern Hebrew city. World War I created unprecedented opportunities for Zionist diplomacy. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 represented the first major power endorsement of Jewish national aspirations in Palestine. British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild expressing government support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The Balfour Declaration's language seemed almost prophetic to many observers. Isaiah 66 verse 8 had asked, "Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall the earth be made to give birth in one day, or shall a nation be born at once?" The possibility that ancient prophecy might find modern fulfillment began attracting attention from both Jewish and Christian observers. The British Mandate period from 1920 to 1948 witnessed massive Jewish immigration despite Arab opposition and British restrictions. The third Aliyah brought 40,000 immigrants, the fourth brought 82,000, and the fifth brought over 250,000. Each wave strengthened Jewish presence while creating tensions that would shape regional conflicts for generations. These immigration waves transformed Palestine's demographics and economy. Jewish agricultural techniques improved crop yields. Industrial development created employment opportunities. Educational institutions preserved and transmitted Jewish culture while adapting it to modern conditions. The Hebrew University, founded in 1925, became a symbol of Jewish intellectual renaissance. The rise of Nazi persecution in Europe gave Zionist arguments tragic validation. As European Jewish communities faced increasing restrictions and violence, Palestine emerged as refuge for those who could reach it. However, British immigration limits meant that many who sought safety were turned away, creating moral crises that would influence post-war politics. During World War II, the Jewish community in Palestine supported the Allied cause while simultaneously preparing for independence. The Jewish Brigade fought alongside British forces against Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, underground organizations developed military capabilities that would prove crucial in coming conflicts. The Holocaust's revelation of European Jewry's near-complete destruction created international sympathy for Jewish national aspirations. 6 million deaths provided tragic evidence for Zionist arguments about the necessity of Jewish political independence. The survivors who reached Palestine brought both trauma and determination to build a homeland that could protect Jewish life. Archaeological discoveries during the Mandate period strengthened Jewish historical claims to the land. Excavations revealed ancient Hebrew inscriptions, biblical-era settlements, and other evidence of continuous Jewish presence throughout history. These findings supported Zionist arguments that Jews were returning home rather than colonizing foreign territory. The development of modern Hebrew as a spoken language represented one of Zionism's most remarkable achievements. Eliezer ben Yehuda and others successfully revived a language that had survived primarily in religious contexts. Hebrew newspapers, schools, and literature created cultural foundations for eventual statehood. Labor Zionism created unique social institutions that blended Jewish values with socialist ideals. The kibbutz movement established collective communities based on equality and shared responsibility. The Histadrut Labor Federation organized workers while providing social services. These institutions demonstrated Jewish capacity for self-governance. Religious Zionism offered different but complementary perspectives on Jewish return to the land. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook and others saw secular Zionist achievements as unconscious fulfillment of divine purposes. Even non-religious Jews were participating in messianic processes they didn't fully understand. The growing Jewish population in Palestine created inevitable conflicts with Arab residents who had not expected or welcomed such demographic changes. The 1936-1939 Arab Revolt represented organized resistance to continued Jewish immigration and land purchases. British responses included restrictions that limited Jewish refugee possibilities during Europe's darkest hour. By 1947, the Jewish community in Palestine had developed most institutions necessary for independent statehood. Military forces, educational systems, economic networks, and political structures were functioning effectively. The question was no longer whether Jews could govern themselves, but whether they would be permitted to do so. The United Nations Partition Plan of November 1947 provided international recognition for Jewish national rights in part of Palestine. The vote represented unprecedented global acknowledgement that Jews deserved political independence in their historical homeland. Arab rejection of partition set the stage for the conflicts that would follow. Therefore, the Zionist movement and waves of Jewish immigration transformed Palestine from Ottoman backwater to thriving Jewish community ready for independence. What began as reaction to European anti-Semitism became fulfillment of ancient biblical prophecies. The dry bones were indeed coming together, preparing to breathe again as a living nation. The world changes overnight on May 14, 1948. As the British mandate over Palestine expired, David Ben-Gurion stood in the Tel Aviv Museum and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Within minutes, President Harry Truman announced American recognition of the new nation. After nearly 2 millennia of exile, the Jewish people had regained political independence in their ancestral homeland. The event seemed to fulfill ancient prophecies while reshaping modern Middle Eastern realities. The declaration itself was both pragmatic document and prophetic fulfillment. Ben-Gurion spoke of the Jewish people's historical connection to the land, their suffering in exile, and their natural right to national independence. He invoked the United Nations Partition Resolution while appealing to principles of justice and international law. Yet many listeners heard deeper resonances in his words. Isaiah 66 verse 8 had posed the rhetorical question, "Who has heard such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall a country be born in a day? Or shall a nation be brought forth at once?" The prophet's ancient words seemed to find literal fulfillment as Israel became a recognized nation within hours of its declaration. The surrounding Arab nations responded exactly as many had predicted. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq launched coordinated attacks designed to strangle the Jewish state in its infancy. The newborn nation faced immediate existential threat from enemies that possessed superior numbers, equipment, and strategic positions. Yet the outcome defied conventional military wisdom. Israeli forces not only survived the initial assault, but gradually gained the initiative. By 1949, armistice agreements had established Israel's control over territory beyond even the UN partition boundaries. The nation that should have been destroyed had instead expanded its holdings. The survival and success seemed miraculous to many observers. Israeli forces had been outnumbered roughly 50-1 when the fighting began. Arab armies possessed tanks, aircraft, and artillery that the Israelis lacked. Professional military analysts had predicted swift Arab victory. The actual results appeared to contradict natural expectations. Religious Jews saw divine providence in Israel's military victories. Secular Israelis spoke of determination and superior organization. International observers noted various factors, including Arab disunity, strategic mistakes, and unexpected Israeli capabilities. Yet even skeptics acknowledged that something remarkable had occurred. The war created both triumph and tragedy. Jewish national independence was secured, but hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs became refugees. Israeli celebrations were matched by Arab mourning over what they called the Nakba, the catastrophe. The conflict's human costs would influence regional relationships for generations. Holocaust survivors played significant roles in Israel's founding struggles. Many who had escaped Nazi persecution found themselves immediately fighting for survival again. Their presence gave special meaning to the Jewish state's establishment as refuge for a people who had learned the deadly consequences of powerlessness. The new nation's institutions had to be created virtually overnight. Government ministries, military commands, diplomatic services, and legal systems all required immediate establishment. The Declaration of Independence promised democracy, equality, and protection for minorities, principles that would be tested repeatedly in coming years. International recognition came swiftly from major powers despite Arab protests. The Soviet Union, seeking to reduce British influence in the Middle East, supported Jewish independence alongside the United States. This rare superpower agreement provided crucial diplomatic protection during Israel's vulnerable early years. The agricultural communities established during earlier immigration waves became strategic assets during the Independence War. Kibbutzim and moshavim served as defensive positions while continuing food production. The pioneers who had drained swamps and planted orchards now found their settlements forming Israel's defensive perimeter. Hebrew language development accelerated dramatically with statehood. Government operations, military commands, and diplomatic communications all required Hebrew terminology that often had to be invented on the spot. The The language revival had begun with Zionist immigration now became practical necessity for national functioning. The Israeli military's performance surprised even its own commanders. The Haganah transformed from underground militia to national army within months. Weapons purchases from Czechoslovakia and other sources provided essential equipment. But organizational ability and fighting motivation proved equally important to survival. Arab military failures reflected various factors, including poor coordination, political interference, and underestimation of Jewish determination. Egyptian forces performed better than others, but still fell short of objectives. Syrian and Lebanese attacks were contained. Iraqi involvement remained limited. Jordan's Arab Legion fought most effectively but had conflicting political objectives. The population exchanges that accompanied the conflict created long-term demographic changes. Roughly 600,000 to 700,000 Palestinian Arabs left areas that became Israeli territory, while similar numbers of Jewish refugees fled Arab countries to settle in Israel. These movements created refugee populations and integration challenges that persist today. Israel's victory established precedents that would influence future conflicts. Military superiority became central to national strategy given the hostile neighborhood. Preemptive action was validated as defensive necessity. International opinion proved less important than military capability for ensuring survival. The establishment of Israel activated prophetic expectations among both Jews and Christians worldwide. Many saw the return to the land as fulfillment of Ezekiel's vision of dry bones living again. Others interpreted events as signs of approaching messianic age. Skeptics dismissed such interpretations, but the symbolic power remained undeniable. Therefore, May 14, 1948 marked more than the birth of another nation. It represented the reversal of nearly 2 millennia of Jewish powerlessness and the fulfillment of hopes that had sustained a people through centuries of persecution. The world changed overnight as ancient prophecy found modern fulfillment in ways that continue to influence regional conflicts and global politics. Iran before the storm. Westernization and boiling resentment. In the years following World War II, Iran underwent rapid transformation that would ultimately lead to revolutionary upheaval. The Pahlavi dynasty pursued aggressive modernization while traditional society simmered with resentment. Understanding this period illuminates how the nation that had once blessed the Jewish people became the heart of contemporary Middle Eastern opposition to Israel. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi ascended the throne in 1941 after his father's forced abdication by Allied powers. The young ruler inherited a country caught between competing foreign influences and domestic pressures. British and Soviet forces occupied Iranian territory during the war, demonstrating the nation's vulnerability to outside intervention. The 1953 coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh marked a crucial turning point in Iranian political development. When Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, British and American intelligence services orchestrated his overthrow. The CIA MI6 operation restored the Shah to power, but created lasting resentment against Western interference in Iranian affairs. The oil revenues that followed the 1954 Consortium Agreement provided resources for ambitious modernization programs. The Shah used petroleum income to fund industrial development, military expansion, and social reforms. Iran's economy grew rapidly during the 1960s and 1970s, creating a middle class with rising expectations but also widening inequality. The White Revolution, launched in 1963, aimed to transform Iranian society without political liberalization. Land reform redistributed large estates to peasants. Women received voting rights and expanded educational opportunities. Literacy campaigns reduced illiteracy rates significantly. Industrial development created employment in cities. However, these reforms also created powerful enemies. Traditional landlords resented property redistribution. Religious clerics opposed women's expanded roles and secular education. Small merchants struggled against modern commercial practices. The bazaar economy felt threatened by industrial competition and foreign imports. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini emerged as the most prominent clerical opponent of the Shah's reforms. His 1963 speeches against the White Revolution led to his arrest and eventual exile. From Najaf in Iraq Khomeini developed his theory of wilayat al-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which would later justify clerical rule. The Shah's relationship with Israel became increasingly close during this period. Iran recognized Israel in 1950 and developed extensive economic and security cooperation. Israeli expertise helped Iran's agricultural and technological development. Iranian oil supplied Israeli energy needs. Military cooperation included joint intelligence operations. This partnership created additional opposition to the Shah among religious conservatives who viewed Israel as Islam's enemy. Khomeini and other clerics regularly denounced Iranian-Israeli cooperation as betrayal of Islamic principles. Anti-Israel sentiment became intertwined with opposition to the monarchy itself. The secret police organization known as SAVAK, established with CIA and Mossad assistance, became symbol of repression for the Shah's opponents. While effective in maintaining security, SAVAK's methods created fear and hatred that would later fuel revolutionary fervor. Political prisoners were tortured and opposition activities were ruthlessly suppressed. Cultural policies under the Shah promoted pre-Islamic Persian identity at the expense of Islamic traditions. The 1971 celebration of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy at Persepolis exemplified this approach. The extravagant festivities highlighted ancient Zoroastrian heritage while ignoring Islamic history and contemporary poverty. Educational expansion created unintended consequences for the monarchy. Universities produced graduates who expected political participation but found few outlets for expression. Student movements in the 1970s became centers of opposition to authoritarian rule. Many students embraced either leftist ideologies or Islamic fundamentalism. Economic growth concentrated in major cities while rural areas remained underdeveloped. Migration to Tehran and other urban centers created overcrowded conditions and social tensions. Traditional communities were disrupted by modernization without adequate support systems being provided. The oil boom of the 1970s accelerated both development and instability. Massive revenues funded ambitious projects including nuclear power plants and advanced military equipment. However, rapid change overwhelmed institutional capacity and created inflation that hurt middle-class supporters of the regime. Foreign influence remained visible throughout this period. American military advisors trained Iranian forces. Western companies dominated major development projects. English became the language of higher education and business. These changes reinforced perceptions that Iran was losing its independence and identity. Religious institutions provided the only significant independent space in Iranian society. Mosques, religious schools, and clerical networks operated with relative autonomy. When political opposition was suppressed, religious leaders could still communicate with followers through sermons and traditional observances. The bazaar economy maintained its traditional structure despite industrial modernization. Merchants and craftsmen preserved social networks that connected religious and commercial interests. These networks would prove crucial for mobilizing opposition when revolutionary opportunity arose. By the mid-1970s, various opposition groups were finding common ground in hostility to the Shah's regime. Leftist organizations, Islamic fundamentalists, nationalist parties, and liberal Democrats all sought the monarchy's overthrow. Their ideological differences would be resolved only after the revolution succeeded. The human rights policies of President Jimmy Carter created additional pressure on the Shah to liberalize his rule. Political prisoners were released, censorship was relaxed, and opposition activities increased. These concessions were interpreted as signs of weakness rather than reform, encouraging more radical demands. Therefore, the modernization period under the Pahlavis created conditions for revolutionary upheaval. Rapid change disrupted traditional society while authoritarian rule prevented peaceful political expression. Anti-Western resentment merged with religious opposition to create the explosive mixture that would transform Iran and reshape Middle Eastern politics after 1979. The Revolution of 1979, a theocracy reborn. The year 1979 changed everything. In Tehran's streets, millions gathered with one voice. They carried signs. They chanted prayers. They demanded the Shah's departure. But this revolution carried deeper currents than political anger. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had spent 14 years in exile. first in Turkey, then Iraq, finally France. During those long years, he wrote. He planned. He developed a vision that would reshape an ancient land. His book, Islamic Government, outlined something the world had never seen in modern times: a state ruled completely by religious law, a government where clergy held ultimate power. The Shah's regime crumbled faster than anyone expected. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, once supported by America and Britain, found himself abandoned. His secret police, the Savak, had tortured thousands. His modernization programs had enriched the wealthy while leaving many behind. The people's anger had been building for decades. Khomeini returned to Iran on February 1st, 1979. 2 million people lined the streets from the airport to the capital. They called him their imam. They saw him as their savior. Within weeks, the monarchy that had ruled Persia for centuries disappeared. But Khomeini's revolution went far beyond removing the Shah. He established something called Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. This meant that religious scholars would have final say over all government decisions. They would interpret not just spiritual matters, but economics, foreign policy, and war. The new constitution declared Iran an Islamic republic. It established a supreme leader position above the president. It created councils of religious guardians to oversee elections. It mandated that all laws must conform to Islamic jurisprudence. The state became inseparable from faith. Khomeini's Shia theology shaped everything that followed. Unlike Sunni Islam, Shia believers expect a hidden imam called the Mahdi to return and establish justice on earth. They believe this return will happen during a time of great chaos and war. The Islamic Republic positioned itself as the guardian of this expectation. The revolution also embraced something called exporting the revolution. Iran's leaders believed their success was not meant for Persia alone. They saw themselves commissioned to spread their model across the Islamic world. This mission would bring them into direct conflict with existing powers. Within months, Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran. They held 52 hostages for 444 days. This crisis announced to the world that Iran had become America's enemy. The hostage crisis revealed the depth of anti-Western sentiment that had been brewing. The new regime began purging the military, the government, and the universities. Thousands of officials from the Shah's era faced execution or imprisonment. Women's rights vanished overnight. Revolutionary guards patrolled the streets, enforcing Islamic dress codes and behavior. Iran's transformation sent shockwaves across the Middle East. Sunni Arab rulers feared their own Shia populations might rebel. The Soviet Union worried about Islamic fervor spreading to its Central Asian republics. Israel watched with growing concern as a former regional partner became a sworn enemy. The revolution's leaders spoke in apocalyptic terms. They called America the Great Satan and described their struggle in cosmic proportions. They saw themselves fighting not just political battles, but spiritual warfare against evil forces. This worldview would shape Iran's policy for decades to come. By the end of 1979, the ancient land of Persia had become something entirely new. A theocracy guided by revolutionary fervor and messianic expectations. The implications of this transformation would ripple across the world and through the pages of prophecy. The little Satan through Tehran's eyes. Iran's revolutionaries had a name for the newly reborn nation to their west. They called it the Little Satan. This label revealed something deeper than political hostility. It exposed a theological framework that viewed the conflict in spiritual terms. The Islamic Republic's founding documents declared opposition to what they called the Zionist entity. They refused to use the name of the modern state, instead referring to it as an occupation of sacred Islamic land. This linguistic choice reflected their belief that recognition would legitimize what they saw as an illegitimate creation. Ayatollah Khomeini taught that the establishment of a Jewish state in the heart of the Islamic world represented a cosmic affront. In his view, this violated divine order. He preached that Muslims had a religious duty to oppose this presence until it disappeared from the map. The theological roots of this hostility traced back through centuries of Islamic teaching about Jews and Christians as people of the book. Traditional Islamic law had allowed Jews to live as protected minorities, called dhimmis, under Muslim rule. But Jewish sovereignty over Muslim land challenged this ancient arrangement. Iran's revolutionary leaders drew from both Shia eschatology and modern political thought. They combined traditional religious teachings with contemporary anti colonial rhetoric. They portrayed the conflict as both a struggle for Palestinian rights and a battle against Western imperialism. The revolution's ideologists taught that America and its regional allies formed a network of domination over the Islamic world. In this framework, the Jewish state served as America's advanced military base. They saw it as a tool designed to keep Muslim nations divided and weak. Iranian state television, radio, and newspapers promoted this narrative daily. Friday sermons in mosques across the country reinforced these themes. School textbooks taught children to view the conflict through this lens. The message became embedded in Iranian culture. The Islamic Republic also embraced the Palestinian cause as central to its identity. Revolutionary Guards trained Palestinian militants. Iran provided funding and weapons to armed groups opposing the Jewish state. These proxy relationships became a cornerstone of Iranian regional strategy. Tehran's leaders spoke frequently about the eventual liberation of Jerusalem. They described this not as conquest, but as restoration of rightful Islamic rule. They taught that the city's status under Jewish sovereignty was temporary and would eventually be reversed. The Iranian calendar marked an annual Quds Day dedicated to Jerusalem's liberation. On this day, massive rallies filled Tehran's streets. Crowds burned flags and chanted for the destruction of the Jewish state. Government officials delivered speeches promising support for Palestinian resistance. Iran's hostility also connected to broader Shia beliefs about justice and oppression. Shia theology emphasizes standing with the oppressed against oppressors. Revolutionary leaders presented Palestinians as the oppressed and their adversaries as oppressors in this cosmic struggle. The Islamic Republic's constitution specifically mentioned liberating Jerusalem as a state objective. This wasn't merely foreign policy rhetoric, it was embedded in the nation's founding charter as a sacred mission. Iranian leaders saw themselves as divinely appointed to pursue this goal. Geographic proximity intensified the conflict's importance. Iran and the Jewish state, while not sharing borders, existed in the same volatile region. Iranian influence in Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza created multiple potential flashpoints. The conflict became personal rather than distant. Tehran's perspective also reflected deeper anxieties about Western influence in the Islamic world. The revolution had expelled Western powers from Iran, but the continued presence of Western allies in the region reminded Iranians that their revolution remained incomplete. This theological framework transformed a regional political dispute into something larger. Iranian leaders taught their people to see the conflict as part of a global struggle between truth and falsehood. This cosmic interpretation would drive Iranian policy for generations. A war by proxy: Hezbollah, Hamas, and Psalm 83. Iran's revolutionary government faced a problem after 1979. They wanted to confront their enemies, but lacked the military power for direct confrontation. The solution came through partnerships with like-minded groups across the region. This strategy would reshape Middle Eastern warfare. The first and most successful proxy relationship emerged in Lebanon. In 1982, when armies invaded Lebanon during civil war, Iran saw an opportunity. They sent Revolutionary Guards to the Bekaa Valley to organize Shia communities there. This mission would birth one of the world's most effective militant organizations. Hezbollah, meaning Party of God, officially announced itself in 1985. But Iranian support had been flowing for 3 years already. Revolutionary Guards provided training, weapons, and funding. They helped establish a sophisticated military structure disguised as a political and social movement. The new organization's founding manifesto called for the destruction of the Jewish state and the establishment of Islamic rule in Lebanon. It pledged allegiance to Iran's supreme leader and adopted revolutionary Iran's ideology. This created Iran's first successful proxy force. Hezbollah's success encouraged Iran to expand this strategy. Palestinian groups in Gaza and the West Bank received Iranian support. The Islamic Republic provided funding, weapons, and training to various factions fighting against Jewish sovereignty. Hamas emerged from the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1987. While initially independent, it gradually developed closer ties with Iran despite theological differences. Sunni Hamas and Shia Iran found common ground in their shared opposition to the Jewish state. Iran's proxy strategy served multiple purposes. It allowed Iran to pressure its enemies without risking direct military confrontation. It provided plausible deniability for attacks. It spread Iranian influence across the region through local partners who shared common goals. The network expanded beyond Palestine and Lebanon. Iran cultivated relationships with Shia militias in Iraq after 2003. It supported Houthi rebels in Yemen's civil war. It maintained ties with various groups throughout the Persian Gulf region. This proxy strategy created what some analysts called a ring of fire around the Jewish state. Iranian-supported groups operated from Gaza in the south, Lebanon in the north, and Syria in the northeast. This geographic encirclement increased pressure from multiple directions. Biblical scholars noted parallels between this situation and ancient prophecies. Psalm 83 describes a confederacy of nations plotting against the people of the covenant. The psalm lists various ancient peoples who surrounded the land of promise with hostile intent. The psalm mentions Edom, Moab, the Hagrites, Gebal, Ammon, Amalek, Philistia, and Tyre. These ancient names correspond roughly to territories now occupied by Jordan, Lebanon, Gaza, and parts of Syria. Iranian proxies operated in many of these same geographic areas. Modern readers of prophecy saw striking similarities between the psalm's description and contemporary events. Ancient enemies had been replaced by modern proxy groups, but the geographic pattern remained consistent. The psalm's language about plotting to cut them off from being a nation echoed in modern rhetoric. Iran's proxy network also demonstrated sophisticated coordination. Attacks often occurred simultaneously from multiple directions. Weapons and tactics spread quickly between different groups. Intelligence sharing allowed coordinated planning across vast distances. The proxy strategy proved remarkably durable. Unlike conventional armies that could be defeated in decisive battles, proxy networks could absorb losses and reconstitute themselves. They operated among civilian populations, making conventional military responses difficult. Iran invested billions of dollars annually in maintaining these relationships. Revolutionary Guards provided ongoing training and technical support. Iranian weapons factories produced specialized equipment designed for proxy warfare rather than conventional military operations. This network created a new form of warfare that blurred traditional boundaries between states and non-state actors. Iran could wage war without formally declaring war. It could attack without taking direct responsibility. The proxy system allowed sustained pressure while avoiding escalation to full-scale conflict. The success of Iran's proxy strategy influenced other regional powers to adopt similar approaches. The Middle East became a complex web of proxy relationships that made direct diplomacy increasingly difficult. Small conflicts could quickly escalate through these interconnected networks. America, the great intruder, ally, or Babylon. The United States emerged from World War II as the world's dominant power. This new position brought responsibilities that previous American generations had never imagined. The Middle East, with its vast oil reserves and strategic location, became a central focus of American foreign policy. America's relationship with the Jewish state began before its official founding. President Harry Truman recognized the new nation 11 minutes after its Declaration of Independence in 1948. This quick recognition established a partnership that would endure for decades, despite periodic tensions. The relationship deepened during the Cold War. America saw the Jewish state as a democratic ally surrounded by Soviet-influenced Arab nations. Military aid flowed steadily, eventually reaching billions of dollars annually. Intelligence cooperation created bonds between the two nations' security establishments. American Christians played a significant role in supporting this alliance. Evangelical communities, numbering in the tens of millions, interpreted biblical prophecy as requiring Christian support for the Jewish return to their ancestral homeland. This theological commitment influenced American politics for generations. But America's Middle Eastern involvement created unintended consequences. The 1953 coup that restored the Shah to power in Iran generated decades of resentment among ordinary Iranians. Many saw America as an imperial power that interfered in their internal affairs for economic benefit. The Shah's close relationship with America and the Jewish state further inflamed Iranian public opinion. Revolutionary movements used this alliance as evidence that the Shah served foreign rather than Iranian interests. Anti-American sentiment became central to opposition politics. When revolution came in 1979, America found itself with a powerful new enemy. The hostage crisis at the American embassy demonstrated Iranian willingness to directly challenge American power. Revolutionary leaders declared America the Great Satan and made opposition to American influence a central organizing principle. Iran's revolutionary ideology portrayed America as the leader of global forces opposing Islamic awakening. In this worldview, America used its military and economic power to maintain an unjust international system that oppressed Muslim peoples worldwide. The alliance between America and the Jewish state became, in Iranian eyes, proof of a coordinated conspiracy against Islam. Revolutionary propaganda depicted the two nations as partners in a campaign to dominate and exploit the Islamic world. American military bases throughout the Persian Gulf region reinforced Iranian fears of encirclement. Revolutionary leaders taught their people that America sought to control Middle Eastern oil resources and suppress any challenge to its regional hegemony. Biblical prophecy students in America interpreted these developments through various theological lenses. Some saw America as a force for good, divinely appointed to protect the Jewish state and advance Christian missions worldwide. Others worried that American power might ultimately oppose God's purposes. The book of Revelation's references to Babylon the Great generated particular concern among prophecy watchers. They debated whether this symbolic city represented ancient Babylon, modern Iraq, America, or some future global system. The ambiguity created ongoing theological discussions. America's involvement in multiple Middle Eastern wars after 2001 intensified these debates. Military campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq demonstrated American willingness to use force in the Islamic world. Iranian leaders portrayed these interventions as proof of American imperial ambitions. The Arab Spring uprisings of 2011 created new complications for American Middle Eastern policy. Popular movements challenged long-standing American allies while creating opportunities for Iranian influence. The regional balance of power shifted in unpredictable directions. American domestic politics also complicated Middle Eastern relationships. Different political parties emphasized different priorities. Some focused on human rights and democracy promotion. Others prioritized stability and counterterrorism. These shifting emphases confused regional partners and adversaries alike. Iran's nuclear program created perhaps the greatest challenge for American Middle Eastern policy. Preventing Iranian acquisition of nuclear weapons became a bipartisan American priority, but achieving this goal required coordinating with allies while managing the risk of regional war. The complexity of these relationships defied simple analysis. America found itself simultaneously allied with Sunni Arab nations that opposed Iranian expansion while supporting the Jewish state that Iran sought to destroy. Managing these competing relationships required constant diplomatic balancing. Iranian leaders consistently portrayed America as the ultimate source of Middle Eastern problems. They taught their people that American withdrawal from the region would solve most existing conflicts. This analysis ignored local sources of tension while oversimplifying complex historical developments. American policymakers struggled to develop coherent strategies for this complex environment. The interconnected nature of Middle Eastern conflicts meant that actions in one area inevitably affected other relationships. No single policy could address all competing interests simultaneously. Nuclear dreams, fire from the East. The atomic age arrived in the Middle East through various paths. The Jewish state developed nuclear capabilities in the 1960s with French assistance, though it never officially confirmed or denied possessing nuclear weapons. This ambiguous policy created regional uncertainty about the true nuclear balance of power. Iran's nuclear program began during the Shah's reign in the 1970s. The monarchy signed contracts with American, German, and French companies to build multiple nuclear reactors. These civilian projects aimed to generate electricity while reducing dependence on oil exports. The 1979 revolution initially slowed Iran's nuclear development. Revolutionary leaders viewed the Shah's nuclear projects with suspicion as symbols of Western influence. Construction on the Bushehr reactor, begun by German companies, halted when the new government expelled foreign technicians. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s changed revolutionary Iran's perspective on nuclear technology. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against Iranian forces and civilians. Iranian leaders realized that conventional military forces could not protect them from weapons of mass destruction. After the war ended in 1988, Iran quietly resumed nuclear development. Russian companies completed the Bushehr reactor that Germans had abandoned. Iranian scientists began training abroad in nuclear physics and engineering. The program expanded gradually over the following decades. International concern about Iran's nuclear intentions grew during the 1990s and 2000s. Intelligence agencies discovered secret facilities that Iran had not declared to international inspectors. The uranium enrichment facility at Natanz and the heavy water reactor at Arak raised questions about Iran's true objectives. Iran's leaders consistently claimed their nuclear program served only peaceful purposes. They argued that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty guaranteed their right to develop nuclear technology for electricity generation and medical isotope production. They denied seeking weapons capabilities. But Iran's secretive approach and defiant rhetoric generated international suspicion. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei issued religious rulings declaring nuclear weapons forbidden under Islamic law. Yet Iranian officials also threatened to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty if pressured too hard. The discovery of Iran's secret nuclear facilities triggered a crisis that lasted more than a decade. The United Nations Security Council imposed multiple rounds of economic sanctions. The United States and European Union added additional penalties targeting Iran's banking, oil, and shipping sectors. Iran's nuclear program became a source of pride for many Iranians despite economic hardship from sanctions. Government propaganda portrayed the program as symbol of national independence and scientific achievement. Public opinion polls showed majority support for peaceful nuclear development. Mysterious incidents began affecting Iran's nuclear facilities during the 2000s. Computer viruses attacked centrifuge control systems. Explosions damaged key installations. Iranian nuclear scientists died in car bombings and other suspicious circumstances. Iran blamed foreign intelligence services for these disruptions. The Stuxnet computer virus, discovered in 2010, represented perhaps the most sophisticated cyber attack in history. The malware specifically targeted Iranian centrifuges, causing them to spin too fast and destroy themselves while reporting normal operations to monitoring systems. Iranian leaders responded to these attacks with increased determination to achieve nuclear independence. They moved critical facilities underground and improved security around nuclear installations. They accelerated development of more advanced centrifuges to replace damaged equipment. Regional powers watched Iran's nuclear progress with growing alarm. Gulf Arab states, despite their oil wealth, announced plans for their own civilian nuclear programs. They feared Iranian nuclear capabilities would shift regional power balances in Tehran's favor. The Jewish state's leaders repeatedly warned that they would not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. They described an Iranian nuclear weapon as an existential threat that justified military action. Intelligence cooperation with the United States intensified as both nations monitored Iranian progress. Biblical prophecy students saw potential connections between Iran's nuclear program and ancient predictions about fire from the east. The book of Revelation mentions plagues of fire, smoke, and sulfur that destroy a third of humanity. Some interpreted these images as descriptions of nuclear warfare. The prophet Joel describes armies from the north that darken the sun and moon. Ezekiel warns of fire falling from heaven. These ancient visions took on new meaning in the nuclear age as readers wondered whether prophets had foreseen atomic weapons. Iran's nuclear program created a paradox for American and allied policymakers. Military strikes might delay Iranian capabilities, but could also trigger regional war and accelerate the program's weaponization. Diplomatic solutions required concessions that Iran's leaders seemed unwilling to accept. The nuclear crisis demonstrated how ancient hatreds could acquire modern dimensions. Religious and ethnic conflicts that had simmered for centuries now carried the potential for unprecedented destruction. The stakes of Middle Eastern rivalry had never been higher. Gog and Magog. Is Persia still in the fight? Deep in the book of Ezekiel lies one of prophecy's most debated passages. Chapters 38 and 39 describe a massive invasion of the restored land of promise. The prophet names specific nations that will participate in this end times coalition. Among them stands Persia. The passage begins with God speaking to the prophet about Gog of the land of Magog. This mysterious figure leads a confederation of nations against the people who have been gathered from the nations and now dwell safely in their ancestral homeland. Ezekiel lists the coalition members by their ancient names. Persia appears alongside Cush, Put, Gomer, and Togarma. These names correspond roughly to modern Iran, Ethiopia, Libya, Turkey, and possibly other nations. The geographic scope spans from Africa to Central Asia. The invasion comes in the latter years, against a land brought back from the sword and gathered from many peoples. The description matches the modern return of Jewish people to their homeland after centuries of dispersion among the nations. The invading coalition comes like a storm and covers the land like a cloud. Their motivation appears to be plunder. They seek to attack those who dwell safely and take spoil and prey from a people who have acquired livestock and goods. Bible scholars have debated these prophecies for centuries. Some interpret them as purely symbolic descriptions of spiritual warfare between good and evil. Others see literal predictions of future military conflicts involving the specific nations mentioned. The timing question generates particular discussion. Some place this invasion before a 7-year period of tribulation. Others position it during or after this time. Still others suggest multiple fulfillments across different historical periods. Modern developments add complexity to these interpretations. The ancient Persian Empire encompassed much more territory than modern Iran. Should the prophecy be understood as referring specifically to Iran or to a broader region that includes Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and parts of other Central Asian nations? Iran's current hostility toward the Jewish state certainly fits the prophecy's description. Iranian leaders regularly threaten to destroy their regional adversary. They support proxy groups that attack from multiple directions. They seek nuclear capabilities that could enable the destruction Ezekiel describes. But other aspects of the prophecy seem less obviously fulfilled. Ezekiel describes the invading coalition as including nations from Africa and possibly Europe. Current Iranian alliances don't clearly match this broader geographic scope. The prophecy also describes the invaded land as dwelling safely without walls, bars, or gates. Modern reality shows a heavily fortified nation with extensive defensive systems. Critics argue this description doesn't match current conditions. Prophecy students offer various explanations for these apparent discrepancies. Some suggest the invasion occurs after a peace agreement creates temporary security. Others argue the description reflects ancient perspectives on warfare and fortification. The prophecy's conclusion describes divine intervention that destroys the invading coalition. Fire and brimstone fall from heaven. The invaders turn their weapons against each other. Only 1/6 of the coalition survives the disaster. This divine rescue leads to global recognition of God's power and purposes. The nations acknowledge the covenant people's restoration. The invasion's failure becomes a turning point in human history toward divine rule. Ezekiel provides specific details about the aftermath. It takes 7 months to bury the dead invaders. Their weapons fuel fires for 7 years. Birds and beasts feast on the carcasses. The cleanup operation employs thousands of workers. These vivid descriptions have generated speculation about modern weapons of mass destruction. Could the 7-year burning period refer to radioactive materials? Might the elaborate burial procedures reflect contamination concerns? Such interpretations remain highly speculative. Iran's role in this prophetic scenario remains unclear despite the specific mention of Persia. The nation's current leadership certainly displays the hostility Ezekiel describes. But future political changes could dramatically alter Iran's international relationships. The prophecy also raises questions about free will and divine sovereignty. If these events are predetermined, do human decisions matter? Can diplomatic efforts prevent what appears divinely decreed? Different theological traditions offer different perspectives on these profound questions. Some prophecy teachers suggest that current events are setting the stage for Ezekiel's vision. They point to Iran's nuclear program, proxy networks, and apocalyptic rhetoric as evidence that the ancient coalition is forming. They urge people to prepare for these climactic events. Others caution against overly specific predictions about timing and participants. They note that prophecy often uses symbolic language that defies literal interpretation. They emphasize spiritual preparation over political speculation. The Gog and Magog prophecy ultimately points beyond military conflict to spiritual realities. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, it affirms divine protection for covenant promises. It declares that human schemes cannot thwart eternal purposes. The spirit of Haman returns, elimination rhetoric. 25 centuries ago, in the Persian capital of Susa, a man named Haman held great power. He served as prime minister under King Ahasuerus. But Haman carried something deeper than political ambition. He nursed a hatred that consumed his soul. The book of Esther tells how Haman's anger began with one man's refusal to bow. Mordecai the Jew would not prostrate himself before Haman as court protocol demanded. This defiance triggered something disproportionate in Haman's response. Rather than punish just Mordecai, Haman conceived a plan to eliminate all Jewish people throughout the Persian Empire. He convinced the king that these people posed a threat to imperial unity. He obtained royal permission to destroy them completely. Haman's edict went forth to all provinces. It commanded local officials to destroy, unlive, and annihilate all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day. The language emphasized totality. No Jewish person anywhere in the empire was to survive. The hatred that drove Haman transcended rational political calculation. His plan would have eliminated valuable subjects who contributed to the empire's prosperity. It risked rebellion and chaos throughout the provinces. Yet, Haman pursued it with obsessive determination. Biblical scholars note that Haman descended from Agag, king of the Amalekites. This genealogy connected him to an ancient people whom God had commanded the Israelites to eliminate completely. The conflict represented a continuation of ancient spiritual warfare. The Amalekites first attacked the Israelites during their exodus from Egypt. They targeted the weak and vulnerable at the rear of the traveling multitude. Their assault came without provocation, while the Israelites posed no threat to Amalekite territory. King Saul later received divine commands to completely destroy the Amalekites and their livestock, but Saul spared Agag and the best animals, keeping what should have been eliminated. This partial obedience allowed Amalekite hatred to survive into future generations. Haman's plot ultimately failed through divine intervention and human courage. Queen Esther revealed her Jewish identity and exposed the conspiracy. The king ordered Haman executed on the same gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. But the spirit behind Haman's hatred did not die with him. Throughout history, similar campaigns of elimination have targeted Jewish communities. Each episode displayed the same irrational intensity that characterized Haman's original plot. The rhetoric of elimination reappeared in various forms across different centuries and cultures. Medieval accusations of well poisoning led to mass expulsions. Modern racial theories justified systematic persecution. Each generation found new rationales for ancient hatred. The 20th century witnessed the most systematic attempt at elimination since Haman's time. Nazi Germany's final solution aimed to remove all Jewish presence from European territory. The language echoed Haman's edict in its emphasis on totality and permanence. Contemporary Iranian rhetoric displays striking parallels to Haman's eliminationist language. Iranian leaders regularly call for the annihilation or disappearance of the Jewish state. They describe its existence as a temporary aberration that history will correct. Former Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad declared that the Jewish state should be wiped off the map. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei described it as a cancerous tumor that must be removed. These statements echo Haman's vision of total elimination. Annual rallies in Tehran feature crowds chanting "Death to America" and "Death to the Zionist regime." Participants burn flags and display banners calling for the destruction of the Jewish state. The atmosphere resembles ancient festivals celebrating planned genocide. Iranian media regularly produces content depicting the destruction of Jewish cities and institutions. Children's television programs show cartoon characters destroying Jewish symbols. School textbooks teach that Jewish sovereignty over any part of the ancient homeland represents an intolerable injustice. The obsessive quality of this rhetoric mirrors Haman's psychological profile. Iranian leaders invest enormous resources in proxy groups dedicated to attacking the Jewish state. They sacrifice economic development and international relationships to pursue this elimination campaign. Like Haman, contemporary elimination advocates claim to serve higher principles. They describe their hatred as opposition to racism, colonialism, or imperialism. But the intensity and irrationality of their rhetoric reveals deeper spiritual motivations. The targeting of Jewish people specifically, rather than all regional adversaries equally, demonstrates the supernatural dimension of this hatred. Other Middle Eastern conflicts involve territorial disputes or resource competition. The Iranian-Jewish conflict transcends these rational categories. Modern elimination rhetoric also displays Haman's characteristic disregard for collateral damage. Iranian proxy attacks often target civilian populations rather than military objectives. The goal appears to be terrorizing entire communities rather than achieving specific political outcomes. The persistence of eliminationist themes across different cultures and time periods suggests spiritual rather than merely political origins. Human hatred alone cannot explain the consistency of this obsession across unrelated historical contexts. Bible students recognize in these patterns the continuation of ancient spiritual warfare. The same demonic influence that motivated Haman continues to manifest through willing human agents. The battle transcends politics to touch eternal realities. The Book of Esther demonstrates that eliminationist plots ultimately fail because they oppose divine purposes. Human schemes cannot thwart eternal promises. The hatred that consumes Haman-like figures ultimately destroys them rather than their intended victims. The martyrs and the remnant, faith under fire. In the ancient city of Shiraz, a young woman named Maryam makes her way through narrow streets. She carries a small backpack containing what many would consider contraband. Inside are copies of the Christian scriptures translated into Farsi. Tonight, she will risk her freedom to share her faith. Iran's Islamic Republic officially recognizes Christianity as a protected religion. The Constitution grants rights to Armenian and Assyrian Christian minorities who have lived in Persian lands for centuries. But these protections don't extend to Persian converts from Islam. Converting from Islam to Christianity carries severe penalties under Iranian law. Converts face charges of apostasy that can result in imprisonment, exile, or worse. Their children may be taken away. Their marriages can be declared invalid. Their inheritance rights disappear. Despite these dangers, Christianity grows rapidly among Persian-speaking Iranians. Satellite television broadcasts Christian programming into Iranian homes. Internet websites provide biblical teaching and worship services. Underground networks distribute religious materials and organize secret gatherings. Pastor Youssef Nadarkhani spent nearly 3 years in Iranian prisons for refusing to renounce his Christian faith. Born into a Muslim family, he converted to Christianity as a young man. When authorities discovered his faith, they arrested him on charges of apostasy and attempting to convert other Muslims. Iranian courts sentenced Pastor Nadarkhani to death, but international pressure eventually secured his release. His case drew global attention to the persecution facing Iranian Christians. It revealed both the dangers and the persistence of faith in hostile environments. The underground Iranian church operates through small house fellowships that meet in homes, offices, and other discrete locations. These groups rarely exceed 10 or 12 people. They communicate through code words and encrypted messages. Security concerns shape every aspect of their worship. Many Iranian Christians discover faith through supernatural encounters. Testimonies consistently describe dreams and visions in which Jesus appears personally to seekers. These divine encounters often provide the courage needed to accept Christianity despite knowing the potential consequences. Elam Ministries, an organization that monitors Iranian Christianity, estimates that over 1 million Iranians have converted to Christianity since 1979. This represents one of the fastest growing Christian movements in the modern world. The persecution intended to eliminate faith has instead catalyzed its spread. Iranian authorities periodically raid suspected Christian gatherings. They arrest participants and interrogate them about their beliefs and contacts. Some detainees face physical abuse designed to extract information about church networks. Others endure psychological pressure through threats against family members. Christian converts often face rejection from their own families. Parents disown children who embrace Christianity. Spouses file for divorce. Extended family members shun converts at social gatherings. The faith that promises eternal life can cost earthly relationships. Yet, testimonies consistently describe peace and joy among Iranian Christians despite external pressures. Secret worship services feature enthusiastic singing, passionate prayers, and careful biblical teaching. The reality of persecution seems to intensify rather than diminish spiritual devotion. Iranian Christians also face challenges in practicing their faith. They cannot openly display Christian symbols or literature. They must baptize new believers in secret locations. They cannot celebrate Christian holidays publicly or maintain visible church buildings. The internet has become a lifeline for Iranian believers. Online communities provide fellowship, teaching, and prayer support. Digital platforms allow isolated Christians to connect with global church networks. Technology has enabled new forms of discipleship and evangelism despite government surveillance. Women play particularly important roles in the Iranian underground church. They often lead house fellowships, share the gospel with other women, and maintain communication networks. The Islamic Republic's restrictions on women's public activities may inadvertently create spaces for Christian ministry. Some Iranian Christians eventually flee the country seeking religious freedom. They join Iranian diaspora communities in Europe, North America, and other regions. These exiled churches maintain connections with believers still in Iran and advocate for religious liberty. The growth of Iranian Christianity parallels similar movements in other Middle Eastern nations where Christianity faces persecution. Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and other strictly Islamic countries report increasing numbers of secret believers despite severe legal penalties. Biblical prophecy students see these developments as potentially significant. The book of Isaiah describes a highway connecting Egypt, Assyria, and the Covenant land. Some interpret this as predicting Christian revival across the modern Middle East, including Iran. The prophet Jeremiah speaks of Elam's captivity being reversed in the latter days. Elam was an ancient kingdom located in what is now southwestern Iran. Some Bible teachers suggest this prophecy refers to spiritual rather than political restoration through Christian awakening. Iranian Christians often describe their faith in prophetic terms. They speak of being chosen to carry the gospel back to the lands where Christianity first flourished. They see themselves as part of God's end times purposes for the Middle East. The courage displayed by Iranian believers echoes the martyrdom accounts in early church history. Like their ancient predecessors, they willingly suffer for their convictions. Their testimonies provide inspiration for Christians facing less severe challenges in other parts of the world. The Iranian church's growth, despite persecution, demonstrates spiritual principles that transcend political systems. Faith often flourishes most vigorously under pressure. The attempt to eliminate Christianity from Iran has instead created conditions that accelerate its expansion. These developments suggest that the ancient conflict between Persia and the people of the Covenant may be transforming from political hostility to spiritual awakening. Iranian Christians pray for their nation's leaders while working to share the gospel with their fellow citizens. Dreams in the dark. Jesus appears in Iran. In a small apartment in Tehran, Ahmad awakens with his heart racing. The dream felt more real than his waking life. A figure in brilliant white robes had appeared, speaking words of peace in perfect Farsi. The man had wounds in his hands and introduced himself simply as Jesus. Ahmad had never set foot in a church. His knowledge of Christianity came only from government propaganda that portrayed it as a Western deception. Yet the figure in his dream radiated love and authority, unlike anything he had experienced. The encounter left him hungry for understanding. Similar testimonies emerge from across Iran with remarkable consistency. Iranians from various backgrounds report dreams and visions featuring Jesus Christ. The experiences cross social, economic, and educational boundaries. Wealthy merchants and poor laborers describe nearly identical encounters. The dreams often follow similar patterns. Jesus appears wearing white garments that emit supernatural light. He speaks in the dreamer's native language with perfect fluency. He offers peace, forgiveness, and eternal life. He identifies himself clearly as the Son of God who died and rose again. Many dreamers initially resist these experiences. They dismiss them as psychological phenomena or spiritual deception. But the dreams often repeat with increasing intensity until the person seeks more information about Christianity. The persistence suggests divine rather than human origin. Traditional Islamic teaching about Jesus acknowledges him as a respected prophet but denies his divinity and crucifixion. The dreams consistently contradict this theology by presenting Jesus as divine and emphasizing his death and resurrection. This creates theological crisis for traditional Muslim believers. Some Iranians report that Jesus speaks directly about their personal struggles and sins. He offers specific comfort about family problems, financial difficulties, or health concerns. These personal details convince dreamers that the encounters represent genuine divine communication rather than subconscious fantasy. The dreams often include instructions about finding Christian communities or obtaining biblical literature. Jesus might direct the dreamer to a specific location or person. He might provide phone numbers or addresses that prove accurate when investigated. These practical elements distinguish the dreams from ordinary religious experiences. Iranian Christians who work with converts report that dream encounters have become the primary pathway to faith among Persian-speaking Muslims. Traditional evangelistic methods carry too much risk in Iran's restrictive environment. But God bypasses human limitations through supernatural revelation. The frequency of these dream encounters appears to have accelerated since Iran's 1979 revolution. Christian organizations that monitor Iranian spiritual developments document thousands of testimonies. The phenomenon extends beyond Iran to Afghan, Tajik, and other Persian-speaking populations. Medical professionals struggle to explain the consistency and impact of these experiences. The dreams often occur among people with no prior Christian exposure or interest. They produce dramatic life changes that persist despite severe persecution. The psychological effects suggest genuine rather than imagined encounters. Some dreamers report receiving the ability to read languages they had never learned. They suddenly understand biblical texts in Arabic, Hebrew, or other scripts. These linguistic gifts enable personal Bible study despite the scarcity of Persian language Christian materials. Iranian authorities have become aware of the dream phenomenon and its connection to Christian conversion. Government-sponsored Islamic teachers now preach against trusting dreams and visions. They warn that Satan uses supernatural deception to lead Muslims away from true faith. But the warnings seem to have little effect on the dream's continuing impact. Iranians continue reporting Jesus encounters at increasing rates. The supernatural experiences provide courage to seek Christian fellowship despite knowing the legal and social risks involved. The dreams sometimes include prophetic elements about future events in the dreamer's life or family. These predictions prove accurate, further convincing recipients that they have experienced genuine divine communication. The fulfilled prophecies distinguish the dreams from ordinary psychological phenomena. Christian ministers working with Iranian converts emphasize the biblical precedent for dream encounters. The Old Testament describes God speaking through dreams to foreign kings and prophets. The New Testament records angelic visitations and divine visions that guided early Christian expansion. The Apostle Peter's vision of unclean animals preceded the gospel's expansion to Gentile populations. Paul's Macedonia vision redirected his missionary journey toward Europe. These biblical examples suggest that God continues using supernatural encounters to guide spiritual awakening in closed nations. Iranian dream testimonies often emphasize Jesus' love and acceptance rather than judgment and condemnation. Dreamers describe feeling overwhelmed by divine compassion despite their spiritual condition. This gracious presentation attracts people who have known only religious law and human performance. The phenomenon extends beyond individual conversions to family and community transformation. Dreamers often share their experiences with relatives and friends. The testimonies spread through existing social networks, creating clusters of new believers in various Iranian cities. Some Iranian Christians interpret the dream encounters as fulfillment of biblical prophecy about the Holy Spirit being poured out in the last days. The prophet Joel promised that God would give dreams and visions to people of all ages and backgrounds. They see current events as validation of these ancient predictions. The dreams provide hope for Iranian Christians who face ongoing persecution. They demonstrate God's active presence in their nation despite government hostility toward Christian faith. The supernatural encounters encourage believers that divine purposes cannot be thwarted by human opposition. These developments suggest that spiritual transformation may be occurring beneath the surface of Iran's political and religious conflicts. While government leaders maintain hostile rhetoric toward Christianity and the Jewish state, ordinary Iranians encounter Jesus Christ in increasing numbers. The dream phenomenon represents a form of spiritual warfare that bypasses human institutions and political systems. No government can regulate what happens in people's sleep. No security force can prevent supernatural encounters that occur in the realm of dreams and visions. Iranian Christians often pray specifically for their nation's leaders to receive similar dream encounters. They believe that divine encounters could transform the hearts of government officials just as effectively as they transform ordinary citizens. These prayers reflect faith that no one lies beyond the reach of divine grace. The Abraham Accords, a prophetic disruption, September 15th, 2020. A moment that shifted the very foundations of Middle Eastern politics. Two jets touched down at Ben Gurion Airport, carrying delegations from the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. The impossible had become reality. Arab nations were making peace with the Jewish state. For 72 years, the Arab world had maintained a unified front. No recognition, no normalization, no peace with the Zionist entity. This wall of rejection stretched from Morocco to Iraq, an unbroken chain of hostility that seemed eternal. Yet, on that September morning, the chain began to break. The Abraham Accords represented more than diplomatic breakthrough. They signaled a seismic shift in regional alliances. Morocco followed. Sudan joined the circle. Behind closed doors, Saudi Arabia began quiet conversations. The Arab street, once inflamed by Palestinian solidarity, grew weary of endless conflict. Ancient prophecies suddenly gained new relevance. Ezekiel spoke of a great invasion from the north, led by Gog of Magog. Among the invading coalition, the prophet named specific allies. Persia would march with the northern prince, so would Cush and Put and Gomer. Yet conspicuously absent from this alliance were the merchants of Sheba and Dedan. Bible scholars have long identified these merchants with the Arabian Peninsula, the ancient trading kingdoms that controlled the spice routes and incense trade. If Ezekiel's vision depicts a future conflict, the absence of Arabian participation becomes significant. The Abraham Accords seem to align perfectly with this prophetic framework. Iran watched these developments with growing alarm. For 4 decades, the Islamic Republic had positioned itself as the champion of Palestinian liberation. It built its entire regional strategy around opposition to the Jewish state. Proxy militias in Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, and Yemen all served this central mission. The rhetoric from Tehran never wavered. The Zionist regime must be eliminated. Now Arab nations were abandoning this cause. The Palestinians found themselves increasingly isolated. Their traditional supporters were signing peace deals and trade agreements with their supposed enemy. The axis of resistance was cracking under the weight of economic reality. The timing felt prophetic to many observers. Just as global tensions reached new heights, just as Iran's nuclear program approached critical thresholds, the regional balance shifted dramatically. Was this divine orchestration? Were ancient prophecies beginning to unfold before modern eyes? The Abraham Accords created a new Middle East, one where Israel stood alongside Arab partners against Iranian expansion, where economic cooperation replaced ideological confrontation, where the old certainties of Arab-Israeli conflict gave way to Persian-Israeli rivalry. The chessboard had been completely rearranged. Tehran's response was swift and predictable. Supreme Leader Khamenei called the Accords a stab in the back of the Palestinian nation. Foreign Minister Zarif warned of dangerous consequences. Proxy groups in Gaza launched rockets at Israeli cities. Hezbollah conducted military exercises along the Lebanese border. The axis of resistance would not go quietly into irrelevance, yet something deeper was stirring. The Abraham Accords represented more than political calculation. They suggested a recognition among Arab leaders that Iran, not Israel, posed the primary threat to regional stability. The Sunni Arab world was choosing sides in the ancient sectarian divide. This alignment carried biblical weight for those who saw prophecy in current events. The book of Ezekiel describes a future invasion where traditional enemies unite against a common target. Persia leads a coalition that includes Turkey, Sudan, and Libya. But the Arabian kingdoms remain neutral observers, watching from afar as the drama unfolds. The Abraham Accords seem to position the players exactly as Ezekiel described. Iran isolated with its radical allies, Israel protected by new regional partnerships. The stage was being set for the final act in an ancient drama. The spirit of Haman returns, elimination rhetoric. 5 centuries before Christ walked the earth, a man named Haman served in the court of Persian king Ahasuerus. History remembers him as a counselor consumed by hatred, not mere dislike or political opposition, but something darker, something that demanded complete annihilation of the Jewish people. There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, Haman told his king. Their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. The solution was simple and final: total elimination. This was more than political maneuvering. Haman's hatred transcended rational explanation. It burned with supernatural intensity, demanding nothing less than genocide. The Persian official had become a vessel for something ancient and evil, a spirit that had plagued the Jewish people since Abraham first received his covenant. Today, similar words echo from Tehran. Israel must be wiped off the map, declared former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The Zionist regime is a cancerous tumor that must be removed. Supreme Leader Khamenei regularly speaks of the coming elimination of the Jewish state. Not defeat, not political change, complete elimination. The parallels are unmistakable. Once again, a Persian court harbors voices calling for Jewish destruction. Once again, the language transcends normal political discourse. If it carries the same apocalyptic intensity that possessed Haman 25 centuries ago. Iranian leaders frame their opposition in political terms. They speak of occupation and resistance, of justice for Palestinians and anti-colonial struggle. Yet the rhetoric consistently crosses into eliminationist territory. Maps of the Middle East hang in Tehran offices with Israel completely erased. Weapons systems bear inscriptions calling for the destruction of the Jewish state. This represents more than geopolitical competition. Regional powers regularly clash without resorting to eliminationist language. Egypt fought multiple wars with Israel but eventually made peace. Jordan engaged in decades of conflict but found diplomatic resolution. Syria maintains hostile relations while avoiding genocidal rhetoric. Iran stands apart in its absolute rejection of Jewish sovereignty, not partial withdrawal from territories, not political compromise or negotiated settlement, complete elimination of the Jewish state and its people. This echoes the ancient pattern that biblical writers recognized as spiritual warfare. The Book of Esther reveals the deeper dimension of Haman's hatred. When Mordecai refused to bow before the royal advisor, Haman's rage expanded beyond personal slight. It seemed small in his eyes to lay hands on Mordecai alone, the text explains. Instead, he sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Modern Iran displays similar logic. What began as opposition to specific Israeli policies has metastasized into existential hatred. Every Jewish achievement becomes a source of rage. Every Israeli innovation sparks new calls for destruction. The Jewish state's very existence represents an intolerable affront to Tehran's worldview. The historical pattern suggests supernatural influence behind such hatred. Human conflicts typically involve competing interests that can be negotiated or resolved through compromise. But eliminationist anti-Semitism operates by different rules. It demands total victory or total defeat with no middle ground possible. Iranian clerics invoke religious authority for their position. They claim Islamic tradition supports their stance, though many Muslim scholars disagree. They cite Quranic verses about fighting oppression while ignoring passages that speak favorably of Jewish people. The selective interpretation reveals ideological commitment rather than theological consistency. Haman also wrapped his hatred in royal concern. He warned King Ahasuerus that Jewish difference threatened Persian unity. Their separate laws and customs made them unreliable subjects. Only their complete removal could ensure imperial stability. The genocidal plan was presented as patriotic duty. Today's Iranian rhetoric follows identical patterns. Leaders claim their opposition serves Palestinian liberation or Islamic unity. They present Israel's destruction as necessary for regional peace. The eliminationist agenda is disguised as humanitarian concern, just as Haman disguised his hatred as royal policy. The spirit behind this hatred transcends individual personalities or political systems. It manifested through Pharaoh in ancient Egypt, through Haman in Persia, through various European rulers across the centuries. Each time it demands the same ultimate solution: Jewish elimination. Iran's current leadership has become the latest vessel for this ancient hostility. The rhetoric from Tehran carries the same supernatural intensity that has plagued Jewish people throughout history. More than politics drives this obsession. Something darker lurks beneath the surface of Iranian policy toward the Jewish state. The prophets speak: Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zechariah. Long before modern satellites tracked missile movements across Middle Eastern skies, ancient seers gazed into the future and saw fire coming from the east. Their visions, recorded in Hebrew scripture, painted pictures of judgment and deliverance that resonate powerfully with current events unfolding between Iran and Israel. Isaiah the prophet lived through the Assyrian invasions of the 8th century before Christ. He witnessed the northern kingdom of Israel carried into captivity and saw Jerusalem itself besieged by foreign armies. Yet, his visions extended far beyond his own time, describing future conflicts that would shake the earth. "Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them," Isaiah declared, speaking of Babylon's coming judgment. The ancient Medes occupied the same territory as modern Iran. They would serve as God's instrument of justice against the oppressive empire. Yet Isaiah's prophecies hint at deeper patterns, where Eastern powers repeatedly play roles in divine judgment. The prophet spoke of a distant day when the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. But before that peaceful culmination, he foresaw terrible conflicts. Nations would rage against God's chosen people. Armies would surround Jerusalem. Yet deliverance would come from unexpected quarters. Isaiah chapter 45 contains one of Scripture's most remarkable passages. The prophet calls Cyrus of Persia "my anointed," using the same Hebrew word translated elsewhere as Messiah. This pagan king would serve God's purposes by allowing Jewish exiles to return home and rebuild their temple. Persia, for a time, would be God's chosen instrument of restoration. The dual nature of Persian involvement creates prophetic complexity. Sometimes the Eastern power serves as God's agent of blessing toward his covenant people. Other times, it appears as an adversary seeking their destruction. This paradox runs through multiple biblical prophecies concerning Iran's ancient predecessors. Jeremiah lived through Jerusalem's destruction and the Babylonian exile. His prophecies describe the scattering of Jewish people among the nations, but also promise their eventual return. He saw armies coming from the north country to devastate the land, yet also spoke of restoration from all directions. Most significantly, Jeremiah prophesied judgment upon all the nations that oppressed God's people. "Behold, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation," he declared. The Eastern powers that carried away the Jewish exiles would themselves face divine retribution. The pattern of judgment and restoration would cycle through history. Jeremiah chapter 49 specifically addresses Persia's fate. "In the latter days I will bring back the captives of Elam," the prophet announced. Elam was the ancient name for the region around modern Iran. This suggests that even nations used for judgment would eventually experience restoration through God's mercy. Yet other passages in Jeremiah describe fierce opposition to Jewish restoration. Enemies would conspire to prevent the return. They would say, "Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more." The language mirrors exactly what modern Iranian leaders declare about the Jewish state. Zechariah prophesied during the early stages of Jewish return from Babylonian exile. He saw visions of Jerusalem's restoration and the temple's rebuilding. Yet he also foresaw future conflicts that would threaten the restored nation. His prophecies bridge the ancient return with end-time scenarios. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about, Zechariah declared. The holy city would become a source of conflict for surrounding nations. They would gather against it, but find themselves unable to prevail. In that day will I make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces. Zechariah's most dramatic vision describes a final siege of Jerusalem. I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, God declares through the prophet. The city would be captured and half its inhabitants taken into exile. Yet, at the moment of greatest crisis, divine intervention would turn the tide. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle. The Messiah would appear on the Mount of Olives, splitting the mountain and creating a great valley. The assembled armies would flee in terror as supernatural judgment fell upon Israel's enemies. These ancient prophecies carry remarkable relevance for current Middle Eastern dynamics. Iran's stated goal of eliminating the Jewish state aligns precisely with the biblical description of nations seeking to cut off Israel's name forever. The gathering of hostile forces around Jerusalem matches both ancient and modern patterns. Yet the prophecies consistently promise ultimate deliverance for God's covenant people. No matter how overwhelming the opposition, no matter how hopeless the circumstances appear, divine intervention would ensure survival and restoration. The same God who preserved a remnant through Babylonian exile would preserve his people through future tribulations. The prophetic pattern suggests that Iran's current hostility toward Israel serves a larger divine purpose. Like Assyria and Babylon before it, the Persian nation may be unknowingly fulfilling ancient prophecies. Its opposition helps set the stage for climactic events that will reveal God's sovereignty over human history. The eastern fire that threatens to consume Jerusalem may ultimately purify God's people instead. The very forces gathered for destruction may witness the most dramatic divine intervention in human history. The prophets who saw judgment coming from the east also saw glory returning to Zion, the martyrs and the remnant, faith under fire. Behind the headlines of missile strikes and nuclear negotiations, a different kind of story unfolds. In hidden rooms across Iran, believers gather despite the constant threat of imprisonment. In Israeli bomb shelters, families pray while sirens wail overhead. Faith persists under fire on both sides of this ancient conflict. The Islamic Republic maintains strict control over religious expression. Official Christianity exists in carefully monitored churches serving traditional ethnic minorities. Armenian and Assyrian congregations trace their roots back centuries, but they operate under severe restrictions. No evangelism of Muslims is permitted. No Persian language services allowed. The penalty for crossing these lines can be devastating. Yet something remarkable has been happening since the 1979 revolution. The more Iran's government oppresses its people, the more they turn to Jesus Christ. House churches multiply in secret. Bible studies meet in basements. Baptisms occur in hidden pools and remote streams. The very persecution intended to crush faith has instead ignited spiritual awakening. Maryam was 19 when she first heard about Christianity. Growing up in Tehran, she had been taught that Christians were enemies of Islam and Iran. But when economic protests erupted in 2017, she began questioning everything her government had told her. A friend shared a Persian language gospel with her through encrypted messaging. Within months, she had given her life to Christ. Now Maryam leads a network of house churches across 3 provinces. She has been arrested twice and spent 8 months in even prison. Her family has disowned her. Former friends cross the street to avoid contact. Yet she speaks of joy and peace that surpass understanding. The suffering has deepened her faith rather than shaking it. Iranian believers face unique pressures beyond government persecution. Converting from Islam to Christianity is considered apostasy, punishable by death under strict interpretation of Islamic law. Though executions for apostasy remain rare, the threat hangs over every convert. Social ostracism is almost universal, economic boycotts common, physical attacks not uncommon. Families often react with devastating rejection when members embrace Christianity. Parents hold funeral services for children who convert, declaring them dead. Spouses file for divorce. Children are taken away. The cost of following Christ in Iran involves losing everything familiar and precious in this world. Yet, testimonies of supernatural encounters continue multiplying. Jesus appears in dreams and visions to seekers across Iran. Muslims who have never heard a clear gospel presentation report detailed encounters with Christ that transform their lives overnight. These experiences cut across all social and economic levels of Iranian society. Dr. Ahmed lived as a respected physician in Mashhad until Jesus appeared to him in a vision 3 years ago. The encounter was so vivid and powerful that it shattered his Islamic worldview completely. Within weeks, he was secretly meeting with other believers. Within months, he was baptizing new converts. Last year, authorities discovered his activities and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. The underground Iranian church operates with remarkable resilience and creativity. Believers use secure communication apps to coordinate meetings. They memorize scripture since carrying Bibles is dangerous. They develop complex protocols for vetting new members and protecting existing networks. Their security measures rival those of political resistance movements. Meanwhile, in Israel, different pressures test faith in different ways. Secular society offers little support for serious religious commitment. Orthodox Judaism views Christian believers as traitors to their heritage. Palestinian Christians face suspicion from both Israeli authorities and Muslim neighbors. War and terrorism create constant stress that can either strengthen or destroy spiritual foundations. Messianic Jewish believers navigate particularly complex terrain. Many fled persecution in other lands to find refuge in Israel, only to face new forms of opposition. Orthodox Jews sometimes attack Messianic congregations. Secular Israelis dismiss them as deluded. Some Palestinian believers question their loyalty to Jesus while supporting the Jewish state. Rachel grew up in a secular family in Tel Aviv. Military service opened her eyes to Israel's precarious position surrounded by enemies. A near-death experience during a terrorist attack led to spiritual searching. She eventually found faith in Jesus while maintaining her Jewish identity. Now she leads a messianic congregation in Jerusalem that includes both Jewish and Arab believers. These believers meet regularly despite ongoing tensions. Jewish members serve in the Israeli military while Arab members have relatives in Palestinian territories. Yet they worship together, pray together, and support each other through crises. Their unity demonstrates possibilities that political leaders seem unable to grasp. During the 2014 Gaza war, Rachel's congregation became a shelter from both communities. Jewish members whose homes were threatened by rockets stayed alongside Arab members whose villages faced military operations. They prayed together for protection and peace. They shared resources and tears. The church became a tiny preview of the reconciliation that biblical prophecy promises for the future. Both Iranian and Israeli believers understand they are living in prophetic times. They see current conflicts through the lens of biblical prophecy. They recognize their suffering as part of larger spiritual warfare that transcends politics and nations. This perspective gives them strength to endure present hardships while maintaining hope for ultimate victory. The martyrs and remnant in both lands represent something precious to God. Their faith remains pure while religious institutions become corrupt. Their love transcends ethnic and national boundaries, while politicians exploit divisions. Their hope rests in divine promises while governments trust in human strength. These believers will inherit the earth when current kingdoms pass away. Their faithfulness under fire prepares them for responsibilities in the coming kingdom. Their present suffering makes them worthy of future glory. The very conflicts that threaten to destroy them are producing something eternal and beautiful. Dreams in the dark. Jesus appears in Iran. Sleep comes fitfully in the Islamic Republic. Between the weight of economic sanctions and the constant surveillance of religious police, ordinary Iranians often find their nights filled with anxiety and fear. Yet in this unlikely setting, something extraordinary has been happening for decades. Jesus Christ has been appearing in dreams across Iran with such frequency that even secular observers acknowledge the phenomenon. Fatima had lived her entire life as a devout Muslim in the holy city of Qom. She prayed 5 times daily, fasted during Ramadan, and wore her hijab with pride. Her father served as a mid-level cleric in the seminary system. Her brothers studied Islamic jurisprudence. Her world revolved around the mosque and the Quran. Christianity seemed as foreign as life on Mars. Then came the dream that changed everything. Jesus appeared to her with a radiance that hurt her eyes to look upon directly. He spoke her name with such tenderness that she wept. He told her that he loved her more than she could understand, and that he had plans for her life that would bring joy beyond imagination. When she woke, the presence lingered so powerfully that she could barely function. Fatima tried to dismiss the experience. Perhaps it was just stress from her recent divorce. Maybe she had eaten something that disagreed with her. But the dream returned night after night, each time more vivid than before. Jesus would take her hand and show her visions of heaven. He would answer questions she had harbored secretly about suffering and justice. He would sing over her in a language she didn't understand, but that filled her heart with peace. After 2 weeks of supernatural encounters, Fatima finally shared her experience with a trusted friend. To her amazement, the friend whispered that something similar had happened to her cousin in Shiraz. Soon, Fatima discovered an entire network of Iranian women who had experienced visits from Jesus in their dreams. They met secretly to share testimonies and pray together. The pattern of Jesus' dreams in Iran follows consistent themes across different regions and social classes. Dreamers report seeing Christ in brilliant white robes, often with nail-scarred hands visible. He speaks their names with perfect love. He answers specific questions about faith and eternity. He invites them to follow him regardless of the cost. The encounters are so vivid that recipients often struggle to believe they were merely dreams. Muhammad worked as an engineer in Isfahan until Jesus began appearing to him nightly. The dreams were so disruptive to his sleep that he initially sought medical help, thinking he might have a neurological condition. Doctors found nothing wrong. The dreams continued with increasing intensity. Finally, Jesus told him directly, "Stop running from me. I died for you specifically. Accept my gift and find the peace you've been seeking your whole life." Within months of his conversion, Muhammad was leading a house church network that spanned 3 cities. He had memorized large portions of the New Testament in Persian. He had led dozens of other Iranians to faith in Christ, all because of a series of dreams that shattered his Islamic worldview and introduced him to the living Jesus. Iranian converts consistently report that their Jesus dreams contain information they couldn't have known previously. Illiterate dreamers quote lengthy biblical passages with perfect accuracy. People with no Christian background describe complex theological concepts that align perfectly with Orthodox doctrine. The dreams seem to carry their own built-in evangelistic curriculum. The Islamic Republic has struggled to respond to this phenomenon. Authorities initially denied that Jesus' dreams were happening at all. When the reports became too widespread to ignore, they claimed the dreams were demonic deceptions designed to lead faithful Muslims astray. Some clerics have preached sermons warning believers to reject any dreams featuring Jesus Christ. Yet the dreams continue multiplying across all segments of Iranian society. University students in Tehran report Jesus encounters. Farmers in rural villages describe identical experiences. Even some clerics have privately admitted to having such dreams, though few dare to act on them openly. The phenomenon crosses ethnic, economic, and educational boundaries with remarkable consistency. Dr. Sarah, a physician in Tabriz, had specialized in treating sleep disorders before her own encounter with Jesus in a dream. She was uniquely positioned to analyze what was happening to her patients. Over several years, she documented dozens of cases where patients reported Jesus dreams followed by dramatic personality changes. The dreamers became more peaceful, more honest, more generous. Many stopped drinking alcohol or engaging in other behaviors that Islamic law prohibits. What puzzled Dr. Sarah most was the consistency of details across unrelated dreamers. They described Jesus with identical physical features. They quoted him saying similar phrases. They reported similar emotional responses to his presence. Either this was the most elaborate mass hallucination in medical history, or something genuinely supernatural was occurring across Iran. Her own Jesus dream finally resolved the question. Christ appeared to her in the same brilliant white robe her patients had described. He spoke the same gentle words they had quoted. He answered her professional skepticism with such wisdom and love that her heart melted completely. She understood immediately why her patients had been willing to risk everything to follow this man they had met in their sleep. The underground Iranian church has learned to recognize Jesus' dream converts by their distinctive characteristics. They arrive at secret meetings already knowing basic Christian doctrines without any formal teaching. They display immediate spiritual maturity that typically takes years to develop. They show remarkable boldness in sharing their faith despite having no church background or training. These dream converts often become the most effective evangelists in Iran. They can speak to other Muslims with authentic understanding of Islamic culture and concerns. They can share personal testimony about Jesus that carries supernatural weight. Their conversions cannot be attributed to foreign missionary influence or Western cultural pressure. Jesus himself recruited them directly through dreams. The phenomenon extends beyond individual conversions to include specific guidance for underground church activities. Believers report dreams directing them to safe meeting locations. Others dream about which new members can be trusted and which might be government informants. Some receive detailed instructions about how to distribute Bibles or conduct baptisms without detection. Pastor Reza leads one of Iran's largest house church networks from his base in Mashhad. He traces his entire ministry to a dream where Jesus showed him a map of northeastern Iran dotted with lights representing future believers. Over 15 years, he has planted churches in every location Jesus highlighted in that original vision. The supernatural guidance has enabled his network to grow while avoiding major persecution. Iranian Jesus dreams represent more than individual spiritual experiences. They suggest that God is bypassing human intermediaries to reach a people group that has been largely isolated from Christian influence for centuries. The dreams are creating an indigenous Persian church that owes its existence entirely to divine initiative rather than human mission strategy. Revelation and Iran, the kings of the East. The Apostle John stood on the rocky shores of Patmos, banished for his faith when heaven opened before his eyes. What he saw in that final book of biblical prophecy has puzzled scholars for 2,000 years. Among the most mysterious passages are references to kings of the East, who play a crucial role in the end times. As tensions between Iran and Israel reach fever pitch, these ancient visions take on new relevance. Revelation chapter 16 describes the sixth bowl of God's wrath being poured out on the earth. The great river Euphrates was dried up so that the way of the kings of the East might be prepared. This massive army from the East marches toward the final battle at a place called Armageddon. The question that has intrigued Bible students for generations is simple. Who are these Eastern kings? The Euphrates River has served as the boundary between East and West since ancient times. It separated the Roman Empire from the Persian Empire. It divided the Byzantine world from the Islamic caliphates. Today it flows through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, forming a natural barrier between the Middle East and the vast expanses of Asia beyond. Traditional interpretation has focused on China as the primary king of the East. With a population exceeding 1 billion and a rapidly modernizing military, China certainly possesses the resources to field an army of 200 million soldiers, as Revelation describes. Recent Chinese expansion into Central Asia and the Middle East through their Belt and Road Initiative gives this interpretation additional credibility. Yet Iran's role cannot be ignored. The ancient Persian Empire controlled everything east of the Euphrates for centuries. Modern Iran maintains significant influence across the region through proxy groups and alliance systems. Iranian forces currently operate in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has become the most powerful military force between the Euphrates and the Indian Ocean. The prophetic timeline in Revelation suggests these Eastern kings emerge during the tribulation period, after the Antichrist has established his global government. They represent a rival power center that challenges his authority. The drying up of the Euphrates removes the final barrier to their western march. Ancient boundary lines disappear as armies prepare for the ultimate confrontation. Iran's current nuclear program adds ominous weight to these considerations. The Islamic Republic has openly stated its intention to develop weapons capabilities. Israeli intelligence agencies have conducted numerous operations to delay Iranian nuclear advancement. The prospect of a nuclear armed Iran fundamentally alters Middle Eastern power dynamics and could fulfill the role of an Eastern king with devastating potential. The geography described in Revelation supports Iranian involvement in end time events. The dried Euphrates would primarily benefit armies originating from the Iranian plateau and regions beyond. Chinese forces would likely approach through different routes. The specific mention of the Euphrates as a barrier suggests the prophecy focuses on powers immediately east of that river. Revelation chapter 9 provides additional clues about these mysterious eastern forces. The sixth trumpet releases four angels bound at the great river Euphrates. These angels lead an army of 200 million horsemen whose breastplates are fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. The description suggests modern military forces rather than literal horses and riders. The colors mentioned in Revelation 9 have prompted speculation about specific nations involved in this Eastern army. Some interpreters see the Chinese flag in the red and yellow combination. Others point to Iranian military uniforms and insignia that incorporate similar color schemes. The hyacinth blue might represent a coalition of nations rather than a single power. Most significantly, this Eastern army brings unprecedented destruction. Fire, smoke, and brimstone pour from their mouths, killing 1/3 of humanity. The language suggests weapons of mass destruction rather than conventional warfare. Nuclear weapons produce exactly the fire, smoke, and brimstone that John struggled to describe with first-century vocabulary. Iran's repeated threats to eliminate Israel take on prophetic significance in this context. If Iranian leaders genuinely believe they are preparing the way for the Mahdi's return, they might view nuclear conflict as a religious obligation. The resulting devastation would fulfill John's vision of unprecedented destruction emanating from the east. Yet Revelation also describes the ultimate fate of these eastern armies. They gather at Armageddon for the final battle, only to face the returning Christ himself. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. The same forces that bring such destruction to the earth are themselves destroyed by divine intervention. This prophetic pattern suggests that Iran's current hostility toward Israel may be part of a larger divine plan. The nation that once served as God's instrument of blessing under Cyrus the Great may now be positioned as an instrument of judgment. The same Eastern power that enabled Jewish return from exile may ultimately trigger the final crisis that brings the Messiah's return. The nuclear standoff between Iran and Israel could represent the beginning of John's Eastern Kings scenario. Iranian development of nuclear weapons would force Israel to consider preemptive action. Such a conflict might draw in other regional powers and eventually escalate beyond Middle Eastern boundaries. The Euphrates boundary between East and West could disappear in the chaos of regional war. Revelation's emphasis on supernatural intervention at the climax offers hope, despite the terrifying descriptions of destruction. The Eastern armies that seem invincible are defeated instantaneously when Christ returns. Human military might proves useless against divine power. The same God who preserved Israel through millennia of persecution will ensure their final deliverance. The mystery of the Eastern Kings may be solving itself as current events unfold. Iran's emergence as a regional power, its nuclear ambitions, its elimination rhetoric toward Israel, and its strategic position east of the Euphrates all align with prophetic descriptions. The ancient visions of John may be approaching fulfillment as the Persian nation prepares for its final role in biblical prophecy. The final deception, the spirit behind the throne. In the corridors of power in Tehran, where ayatollahs make decisions that shake the world, something darker than politics moves behind the scenes. The hatred that drives Iran's obsession with destroying Israel goes beyond strategic calculation or religious difference. It taps into something ancient and malevolent that has opposed God's covenant people since the dawn of history. Scripture speaks clearly about the spiritual reality behind human governments. Paul the Apostle wrote that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. The Iranian leadership may believe they are serving Allah or advancing Persian interests, but they have become instruments in a cosmic conflict that began before human civilization. The pattern stretches back to the Garden of Eden. When God promised that the woman's seed would bruise the serpent's head, spiritual warfare was set in motion. Satan understood that his ultimate defeat would come through the chosen lineage. Every attempt to eliminate the Jewish people throughout history represents another front in this ancient battle between good and evil. Pharaoh's decision to drown Hebrew babies in the Nile seemed like population control policy, but the supernatural hatred behind the decree revealed its true source. The same spirit that whispered in Pharaoh's ear would later speak through Haman in the Persian court. It would inspire Hitler's final solution and guide Stalin's purges. Now it operates through Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei and his Revolutionary Guard commanders. The spiritual dimension explains why Iran's opposition to Israel transcends rational political calculation. Egypt fought multiple wars with the Jewish state but eventually made peace when the costs became too high. Jordan engaged in conflict but found diplomatic resolution when circumstances changed. Syria maintains hostility but avoids eliminationist rhetoric that could provoke devastating retaliation. Iran alone maintains absolute rejection of Jewish sovereignty regardless of strategic consequences. Economic sanctions cripple the Persian economy, but the regime continues funding proxy wars against Israel. International isolation grows deeper each year, yet Tehran refuses any compromise on its core mission. The obsession with destroying the Jewish state has become more important than Iranian national interests. This irrationality points to spiritual influence beyond human reasoning. When political leaders consistently make decisions that harm their own people in service of distant ideological goals, supernatural deception is often at work. The same spirit that convinced Pharaoh to pursue Hebrew slaves into the Red Sea now drives Iranian leaders toward confrontation they cannot win. The Islamic Republic's theology provides perfect cover for this spiritual deception. Shia Islam's emphasis on martyrdom and suffering makes costly conflicts seem spiritually beneficial. The belief that the Mahdi will return during times of great tribulation encourages actions that increase regional chaos. Iranian leaders genuinely believe their hostility toward Israel serves divine purposes. Satan has always been adept at masquerading as an angel of light. He appears to Iranian clerics as religious conviction. He whispers to Revolutionary Guard commanders about Islamic duty. He convinces government officials that nuclear weapons will restore Persian greatness. The deception operates through authentic-seeming spiritual experiences that mask their true origin. The supernatural dimension also explains Iran's remarkable persistence despite overwhelming odds. No rational analysis suggests the Islamic Republic can successfully eliminate Israel through military action. The Jewish state possesses superior technology, better training, stronger alliances, and nuclear deterrent capability. Any direct confrontation would likely result in Iranian defeat and regime collapse. Yet Iranian leaders continue pursuing this impossible goal with religious fervor. They spend billions developing ballistic missiles designed to reach Israeli cities. They build networks of proxy groups dedicated to attacking Jewish communities. They risk everything on a strategy that human wisdom would reject as suicidal. Only supernatural deception could sustain such persistence in the face of inevitable failure. The spirit operating through Tehran understands something that Iranian leaders do not. This conflict is not really about geopolitics or territorial disputes. It represents the final phase of spiritual warfare that began in Eden and will climax at Armageddon. Satan knows his time is short. He also knows that his ultimate defeat comes through God's covenant with the Jewish people. Every Iranian missile aimed at Israel represents another attempt to thwart divine promises that cannot be broken. Every Revolutionary Guard operation in Syria or Lebanon serves the ancient agenda of eliminating God's chosen nation. The same spirit that inspired ancient enemies continues working through modern Persian leaders who have no idea they are serving someone else's agenda. The deception extends beyond Iranian borders to include other nations and movements that find themselves drawn into opposition to Israel. Russian support for Iran, Turkish hostility toward the Jewish state, European indifference to Israeli security concerns all serve the same spiritual agenda. The nations are being gathered for the final confrontation that biblical prophecy describes. Yet Scripture also reveals the outcome of this spiritual warfare. Satan's deception will ultimately serve God's purposes by positioning the players for the last great battle. The very forces gathered to destroy Israel will witness the most dramatic divine intervention in human history. The spiritual power behind Iran's throne will be revealed and defeated in full view of watching world. The Iranian people themselves are not the enemy in this cosmic conflict. Many are turning to faith in Jesus Christ despite intense persecution. The underground church grows stronger each year. Dreams and visions of Christ multiply across all levels of society. The same nation being used as an instrument of spiritual warfare may also become a source of great revival. The deception that grips Iran's leadership will not last forever. Truth has a way of breaking through even the darkest spiritual oppression. The light of Christ is already penetrating the Islamic Republic despite every effort to stop it. The final deception may be powerful, but it cannot overcome the one who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." The war that never ends until it does. For nearly 3,000 years, the conflict between Persia and the Jewish people has cycled through periods of hostility and reconciliation, war and peace, persecution and protection. Kings and empires have risen and fallen, but the underlying tension persists across the centuries. This is not merely a political dispute that can be resolved through negotiation. It represents something deeper written into the fabric of history itself. The pattern began in ancient times when the Babylonian Empire carried the Jewish people into exile. Persia conquered Babylon and inherited this displaced population. Under Cyrus the Great, the relationship was positive. The Persian king became God's anointed, enabling Jewish return to their homeland and rebuilding of their temple. For a brief moment, East and West found harmony. Yet within generations, the same Persian Empire produced Haman, whose genocidal hatred nearly eliminated the Jewish people entirely. Only divine intervention through Esther and Mordecai prevented the first Holocaust. The seeds of future conflict were planted in the very court that had once shown such favor toward God's covenant nation. When Persia fell to Alexander the Great, the eastern lands passed through Greek and later Islamic control. Each transition brought new pressures on Jewish communities scattered across the region. Sometimes they found protection under enlightened rulers. More often they faced restrictions, expulsions, and periodic massacres. The cycle of persecution continued with depressing regularity. The rise of Islam added theological dimensions to the conflict. Early Muslim armies conquered Persian territories and gradually converted the population from Zoroastrianism to the new faith. Initially, Jewish communities received protected status under Islamic law. They could practice their religion while paying special taxes and accepting second-class citizenship. But Islamic theology contained seeds of future conflict. The Quran claimed that Jews had corrupted their scriptures and rejected their promised Messiah. Later Islamic writings described Jews as inherently treacherous and untrustworthy. When combined with European anti-Semitic influences, these teachings created a toxic mixture that would fuel centuries of persecution. The establishment of Shiite Islam as Persia's state religion intensified these tensions. Shia theology emphasized martyrdom, suffering, and an apocalyptic expectation in ways that made conflict with Jewish communities seem spiritually necessary. The coming Mahdi would restore Islamic dominance over all competing faiths. Jewish resistance to conversion became evidence of cosmic evil. Modern Iranian history reflects this ancient pattern with remarkable consistency. The Safavid dynasty persecuted Jewish communities severely, forcing conversions and restricting economic activity. The Qajar dynasty showed more tolerance, allowing Jewish merchants to participate in international trade. The Pahlavi dynasty pursued modernization that benefited all minorities, including Jews. Yet underneath each period of relative peace, resentment continued building. Persian nationalism mixed with Islamic identity created a volatile combination. When economic problems emerged, Jewish success in business made them convenient scapegoats. When foreign powers threatened Persian independence, Jewish connections to international networks raised suspicion about divided loyalties. The 1979 revolution brought these ancient tensions to a boiling point. Ayatollah Khomeini combined Shia apocalyptic theology with modern revolutionary ideology. The result was a state committed to permanent warfare against Jewish presence in the Middle East. What had been periodic persecution became systematic policy for the first time in Persian history. The Islamic Republic's founding documents explicitly call for eliminating the Jewish state, not reforming it or negotiating with it, but erasing it completely from the map. This represents an escalation beyond anything previous Persian regimes had attempted. Never before had an Iranian government made Jewish elimination a core element of state ideology. The nuclear program adds unprecedented stakes to this ancient conflict. Previous Persian-Jewish tensions involved conventional weapons and limited regional impact. Nuclear weapons would give Iran the capability to fulfill its eliminationist rhetoric in ways that were impossible for Haman or previous anti-Semitic rulers. The potential for actual genocide now exists in ways it never has before. Yet the same nuclear capability that threatens Jewish survival also guarantees Iranian destruction if used. Israel possesses second strike nuclear capability that would devastate Iran in retaliation for any attack on Jewish population centers. The mutual destruction scenario creates a deadly balance that previous generations could never have imagined. This balance of terror may represent the final phase of the ancient conflict. Both sides now possess the ability to inflict catastrophic damage on the other. The cycle of persecution and survival that has repeated for millennia approaches its ultimate test. Either both nations will learn to coexist, or both may face annihilation in the attempt to eliminate the other. Biblical prophecy suggests that this particular cycle will not end in mutual accommodation. The scriptures describe a final conflict that surpasses all previous wars in scope and intensity. Nations will gather against Jerusalem in unprecedented numbers. The Jewish people will face their greatest existential threat since the Egyptian bondage. Yet the same prophecies that describe this ultimate crisis also promise divine intervention at the moment of greatest danger. The God who preserved his people through Pharaoh's persecution, Haman's genocide, and Hitler's Holocaust will not abandon them in their final hour. The war that never ends will finally end when the Prince of Peace returns to establish his eternal kingdom. Until that moment arrives, the cycle continues. Iran develops nuclear weapons while Israel prepares defensive measures. Proxy conflicts rage across the Middle East while diplomats seek elusive solutions. The ancient pattern of Persian-Jewish conflict adapts to modern technology while maintaining its essential character. The war that never ends carries within itself the seeds of its own conclusion. The very forces that threaten to destroy God's covenant people will ultimately trigger their final redemption. The darkest hour of Jewish history will become the brightest dawn of human civilization. The war that has defined so much of Middle Eastern history will give way to peace that surpasses understanding. The Great Awakening, a different kind of war. While missiles fly overhead and nuclear centrifuges spin in hidden facilities, another kind of warfare unfolds across the Middle East. This battle is fought not with conventional weapons, but with dreams and visions, testimonies and prayers. The combatants are not soldiers, but ordinary people whose hearts have been transformed by supernatural encounters with Jesus Christ. Across Iran, the most remarkable religious awakening in that nation's modern history is taking place in secret. House churches multiply despite intense persecution. Bible study groups meet in basements and back rooms. Baptisms occur in hidden locations under cover of darkness. The very government that seeks to eliminate the Jewish state finds itself unable to stop the advance of Jewish Messiah among its own people. The numbers are staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over 1 million Iranians have converted to Christianity since the 1979 revolution. More aggressive calculations put the figure closer to 3 million. In a nation of 85 million people, this represents the most significant religious shift in Persian history since the Islamic conquest 14 centuries ago. What makes this awakening remarkable is not just its size, but its indigenous character. Foreign missionaries played almost no role in creating this movement. Instead, Jesus himself appears to be recruiting Iranian converts through dreams, visions, and supernatural encounters. The resulting church carries distinctly Persian cultural characteristics while maintaining Orthodox Christian doctrine. Ali worked as a government engineer in Tehran until Jesus began appearing to him in dreams. Night after night, Christ would visit him with messages of love and forgiveness that contrasted sharply with the harsh religious environment of the Islamic Republic. Within 6 months, Ali had memorized large portions of the New Testament and was leading a house church network that spanned 3 provinces. The Iranian awakening follows patterns seen in other parts of the Muslim world, but with unique intensity. Converts report that their encounters with Christ often include specific instructions about sharing their faith with family members and friends. They receive supernatural boldness to witness, despite the serious legal and social consequences. Many describe a compelling urgency to spread the gospel before some unspecified deadline approaches. This sense of urgency may relate to the believer's understanding of current events through biblical prophecy. Iranian Christians closely follow developments in the nuclear program and regional conflicts. They see their nation's hostility toward Israel as fulfillment of ancient biblical predictions. This prophetic awareness motivates intense evangelistic activity despite severe persecution risks. The underground Iranian church has developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection while maximizing growth. Small cell groups replace large congregations. Encrypted communication apps coordinate activities across vast distances. Scripture memory replaces written Bibles that could provide evidence of illegal activity. The persecution has forced innovation that actually accelerates church expansion. Meanwhile, a parallel awakening is occurring among Palestinian believers in the West Bank and Gaza. Despite living under Israeli military occupation and Palestinian Authority restrictions, Christian Arabs are experiencing revival that transcends political divisions. Their faith communities include both supporters and opponents of the Jewish state, united by shared commitment to Christ rather than political ideology. Nadia grew up in Bethlehem, hating the Israeli soldiers who controlled movement in and out of her city. Checkpoints and barriers made daily life difficult for her family. She participated in protests and supported armed resistance until a serious injury landed her in an Israeli hospital. There, a Jewish Christian nurse began praying for her healing and sharing testimony about Jesus. The encounter shattered Nadia's preconceptions about both Jews and Christians. She realized that her bitterness was destroying her from within, while the nurse's love was bringing healing. Within months, Nadia had given her life to Christ and begun working for reconciliation between Palestinian and Jewish believers. She now leads a ministry that brings together believers from both communities. The growth of Messianic Judaism in Israel adds another dimension to this regional awakening. Jewish believers in Jesus face unique pressures from Orthodox communities that view them as traitors to their heritage. Yet their numbers continue growing, particularly among former secular Israelis who find traditional Judaism inadequate for modern spiritual needs. Rabbi David served in Orthodox synagogues for 15 years before encountering Jesus through intensive study of Hebrew prophecies. His conversion scandalized the religious community where he had been a respected leader. Family members declared him dead and held funeral services. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid contact. Yet David speaks of joy and peace that surpass any suffering. Now, David leads one of Israel's largest Messianic congregations, with members who include Holocaust survivors, military veterans, new immigrants, and Arab believers. They worship in Hebrew while maintaining Jewish cultural practices. Their services blend traditional Jewish prayers with contemporary Christian worship. The result is uniquely Israeli while remaining authentically biblical. These parallel awakenings in Iran, Palestinian territories, and Israel suggest something significant is happening across the entire region. While political leaders prepare for war, ordinary people are finding peace through personal relationships with Christ. While governments build walls and barriers, believers are discovering unity that transcends ethnic and national boundaries. The timing appears prophetically significant. Just as ancient prophecies describe end-time conflicts between East and West, spiritual awakening is preparing a remnant from all sides to survive coming tribulations. The church that emerges from current persecution may be uniquely equipped to minister during the chaos that biblical prophecy associates with the last days. Iranian believers understand that their faith may soon face its ultimate test. If war comes between their nation and Israel, they will be caught between conflicting loyalties. Yet their testimonies consistently emphasize supernatural peace about the future. They trust that the same God who has preserved them through current persecution will guide them through whatever comes next. Palestinian and Israeli believers face similar challenges if regional conflict escalates. Their communities include military personnel who might be called to fight against each other's nations. Yet their fellowship continues despite political pressures. They represent living proof that the dividing walls of hostility can be broken down through the cross of Christ. The Great Awakening occurring across the Middle East may be God's preparation for the great conflict that seems to be approaching. While human leaders position military forces for battle, divine strategy is positioning spiritual forces for redemption. The war that threatens to destroy the region may ultimately become the catalyst for the greatest harvest of souls in Middle Eastern history. The millennium and the hope of peace, beyond the smoke of battle and the shadow of nuclear winter, biblical prophecy paints a picture so beautiful that it takes the breath away. The same scriptures that describe unprecedented conflict also promise unprecedented peace. The very land that has witnessed millennia of warfare will become the epicenter of global harmony when the Prince of Peace establishes his earthly kingdom. Isaiah the prophet saw this future with crystal clarity. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. The weapons factories that now produce missiles aimed at Israeli cities will be converted to manufacturing agricultural equipment. The military bases that train soldiers for conflict will become schools teaching arts of peace. The transformation will be complete and supernatural. Zechariah describes a time when the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one. The competing religious and political systems that fuel current conflicts will give way to universal recognition of divine authority. Tehran's theocratic government and Jerusalem's democratic parliament will both submit to the ultimate theocracy. Jerusalem itself will undergo dramatic physical changes. Zechariah prophesies that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea. In summer and in winter shall it be. The city that struggles with water shortages today will become the source of life-giving streams that flow both east and west. Rivers will pour from the Temple Mount toward both the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea. The political transformation will be equally dramatic. Isaiah declares that out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. The city that divides nations today will become the capital from which divine government operates globally. The same streets where terrorists now detonate bombs will host pilgrims from every nation seeking wisdom and justice. Iran's role in this millennial kingdom receives specific mention in biblical prophecy. Isaiah 19 describes a remarkable transformation of Middle Eastern relationships. In that day shall there be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians. More remarkably, the same prophecy continues. In that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel mine inheritance. The three nations locked in current conflict will become partners in blessing the world. Ancient Assyria included much of modern Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. The highway described by Isaiah would connect North Africa with Western Asia through the land bridge of Israel. Trade and pilgrimage would flow freely across borders that today are sealed by hostility. The very nations preparing for war will become channels of peace. The transformation extends beyond politics to agriculture and environment. Isaiah promises that the wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. The arid landscapes of Iran and Israel will bloom with unprecedented fertility. Deserts will become gardens, Wastelands will produce abundant harvests. This agricultural revival will have supernatural causes. Joel prophesies that God will restore to you the years that the locust hath eaten, and will cause to come down for you the rain, the former rain, and the latter rain in the first month. The same regions that struggle with drought and desertification will receive abundant rainfall that transforms entire ecosystems. The human transformation will be equally dramatic. Isaiah describes a time when the inhabitant shall not say, I am sick. The people that dwell therein shall be forgiven their iniquity. The diseases that plague both Iranian and Israeli populations today will disappear. Cancer rates will plummet. Mental illness will vanish. Physical handicaps will be healed. Death itself will become rare except in cases of extreme old age. Perhaps most remarkably, the very nature of conflict will be transformed. Isaiah prophesies that the wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. If predator and prey can coexist peacefully, surely Persian and Jew can learn to do the same. The educational system will be revolutionized around divine wisdom rather than human philosophy. Isaiah promises that all thy children shall be taught of the Lord, and great shall be the peace of thy children. Iranian students will no longer chant death to America and death to Israel in their schools. Israeli children will not grow up fearing rocket attacks from Iran's proxies. Both will learn the ways of peace from the same divine teacher. Religious diversity will give way to unified worship. Zechariah describes a time when everyone that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Former enemies will make annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem for worship and celebration. The economic system will operate on principles of justice rather than exploitation. Isaiah promises that they shall build houses and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and eat the fruit of them. They shall not build and another inhabit, they shall not plant and another eat. The economic inequality that fuels resentment in both Iran and Israel will disappear as everyone enjoys the fruit of their own labor. International relations will be governed by divine law rather than balance of power. Micah prophesies that nations will come up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. The United Nations headquarters will relocate from New York to Jerusalem as all nations seek guidance from the ultimate authority. This millennial vision provides hope that transcends current circumstances. No matter how dark the present conflict appears, no matter how intractable the hatred seems, no matter how devastating the potential for destruction, the story does not end in mutual annihilation. Beyond the valley of the shadow of death lies a bright tomorrow where former enemies become eternal friends. The millennium represents more than political peace. It offers the possibility of relationships healed, hearts transformed, and purposes fulfilled. Iranian children and Israeli children will play together in streets where their grandparents prepared for war. Former Revolutionary Guards and Israeli Defense Forces veterans will work together building the infrastructure of peace. Has the war already been won? In the eternal councils of heaven, where time bends to divine will and future events are as clear as past history, there is a profound truth that changes everything about the current conflict between Iran and Israel. The war that seems so desperate and uncertain from human perspective has already been decided. The victory was secured not through military might, but through the cross of Calvary 2,000 years ago. When Jesus Christ died outside the walls of Jerusalem, he dealt a death blow to the spiritual powers that fuel all earthly conflicts. Satan's authority was broken. The principalities and powers that drive nations to war were defeated. The ancient serpent who has whispered hatred into human hearts since Eden was publicly humiliated before the watching universe. What appears to be ongoing warfare is actually the death throes of an already defeated enemy. This perspective transforms how we understand current events between Iran and Israel. The nuclear programs, the proxy wars, the elimination rhetoric, the regional tensions all represent desperate attempts by defeated spiritual forces to reverse a verdict that was pronounced on Golgotha. Satan knows his time is short. He also knows that his ultimate destruction comes through God's covenant with the Jewish people. Every Iranian threat against Israel represents another futile attempt to thwart divine promises that cannot be broken. God told Abraham that he would make of his descendants a great nation. He promised Isaac that his offspring would be as numerous as the stars. He assured Jacob that the land would belong to his children forever. These covenants remain in effect regardless of Persian hostility. The resurrection of Christ 3 days after his crucifixion provided proof that death itself had been conquered. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead guarantees the survival of his covenant people. No weapon formed against Israel will ultimately prosper because divine protection surrounds them like a shield. The nations may rage, but their fury accomplishes nothing except the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. This does not mean that the Jewish people will never suffer. The scriptures clearly predict a time of great tribulation that will test their faith to the breaking point, but the outcome is never in doubt. The same God who preserved a remnant through Egyptian bondage, Babylonian exile, and Nazi genocide will ensure their survival through whatever trials lie ahead. Iran's current nuclear program serves divine purposes even while opposing divine will. The threat it poses forces Israel to depend more completely on heavenly protection. The isolation it creates drives Jewish people to seek their Messiah more desperately. The regional chaos it produces prepares the stage for Christ's return to establish his kingdom. Even Persian hostility becomes an instrument of divine blessing. The underground Iranian church provides living proof that the victory has already been won. In the very nation that threatens to destroy God's covenant people, the gospel advances with supernatural power. Dreams and visions of Christ multiply across all levels of society. House churches thrive despite intense persecution. The same spiritual forces trying to eliminate Israel are being defeated by Iranian converts to Christianity. This paradox reveals the genius of divine strategy. God is not simply protecting Israel from Iranian attack. He is simultaneously winning Iranian hearts to the Jewish Messiah. The nation being used as an instrument of spiritual warfare is also becoming a source of great revival. The very people whose government seeks Jewish elimination are finding eternal life through a Jewish savior. From heaven's perspective, the conflict between Iran and Israel serves multiple divine purposes simultaneously. It demonstrates the futility of opposing God's covenant promises. It drives both peoples toward greater dependence on divine intervention. It creates conditions that will eventually lead to Christ's return and the establishment of his kingdom. Even apparent setbacks advance the ultimate divine agenda. The timing of current events reflects divine precision that human planners could never achieve. Iran's nuclear program reaches critical stages just as regional alliances shift dramatically. Israel's military capabilities peak at the exact moment when existential threats emerge. International pressure mounts precisely when prophetic fulfillment approaches. The coordination suggests supernatural choreography behind seemingly random events. This divine perspective offers profound comfort to believers on both sides of the conflict. Iranian Christians can trust that their persecution serves eternal purposes beyond their understanding. Israeli believers can rest in promises that guarantee their nation's survival. Both communities can find peace in knowing that current suffering produces eternal glory that far outweighs temporary tribulation. The victory that was won at Calvary will be fully manifested when Christ returns to establish his millennial kingdom. The same Jesus who defeated death and hell will return as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Every knee will bow and every tongue confess that he alone deserves the throne. Iranian ayatollahs and Israeli prime ministers will alike acknowledge his supreme authority. Until that glorious day arrives, the battle continues on earth, while the victory remains secure in heaven. Missiles may fly and threats may multiply, but they cannot change the fundamental reality that God's purposes will prevail. The war that began in Eden will end with the wedding supper of the Lamb. The conflict that has raged for millennia will conclude with eternal peace under divine government. Human leaders make plans and armies prepare for battle, but the Lord laughs at their schemes. He knows the end from the beginning. He has already written the final chapter of human history. The nations may rage and the peoples plot in vain, but his purposes will stand. The war has already been won by the one who holds the keys of death and hell. The book was written before the battle began, long before the first Persian soldier ever marched toward Jerusalem, long before the first Jewish exile set foot in Babylon, long before Abraham received his covenant or Noah built his ark. The story was already written. In the eternal mind of God, every chapter of human history was already complete. The conflict between Iran and Israel that captivates world attention today is simply the unfolding of a drama whose script was finished before time began. The author of this cosmic drama revealed glimpses of the plot through his chosen prophets across the centuries. Moses saw the scattering and regathering of the Jewish people. Isaiah witnessed the rise and fall of empires from his perspective in the 8th century before Christ. Daniel watched kingdoms succeed each other in precise order. Ezekiel observed the valley of dry bones breathing again. John gazed upon the final battle and ultimate victory. Each prophetic vision added another piece to a puzzle that spans millennia. The prophets themselves often did not understand the full significance of what they were recording. Daniel admitted that his visions were sealed until the time of the end. Zechariah struggled to interpret the symbolic language of his revelations. Peter wrote that the ancient prophets searched diligently to understand their own writings about Christ's sufferings and glory. Yet the pattern emerges with stunning clarity when viewed from our current vantage point. The same God who promised Abraham that his descendants would inherit the land also warned that they would be strangers in a foreign country for 400 years. The captivity in Egypt was not an accident, but a necessary chapter in the predetermined story. When Babylon conquered Jerusalem and carried the Jewish people into exile, it fulfilled prophecies given centuries earlier. When Cyrus of Persia allowed their return, he was unknowingly fulfilling Isaiah's prediction about a pagan king who would serve God's purposes. When Haman plotted genocide in the Persian court, he was playing a role that had been written into the script from eternity. The modern return of Jewish people to their ancient homeland follows the same prophetic pattern. Ezekiel's vision of dry bones coming together preceded the reality by 25 centuries. Isaiah's question, "Can a nation be born in a day?" found its answer in 1948 when Israel declared independence. The regathering that seemed impossible became inevitable because it had been written into the storyline. Iran's current hostility toward the Jewish state likewise fulfills ancient predictions with remarkable precision. Psalm 83 describes a confederation of nations that conspire to eliminate Israel's name from memory. The list includes peoples who controlled territories now dominated by Iranian proxy groups. Ezekiel 38 depicts an invasion from the north led by allies that include Persia. The alignment is too precise to be coincidental. Even the nuclear dimension of current tensions was anticipated in prophetic literature. Zechariah described weapons that would cause flesh to dissolve while people remained standing. Joel wrote about fire and brimstone falling from heaven. John witnessed weapons of mass destruction that killed 1/3 of humanity. The ancient seers struggled to describe technologies that would not be invented for thousands of years. The divine author included multiple plot lines that converge in our current historical moment. The regathering of the Jewish people to their homeland creates the target for end-time enemies. The rise of radical Islam provides the ideological motivation for opposition. Nuclear technology gives human beings the capability for unprecedented destruction. All these elements were necessary for the climactic scenes of human history. The storyline even includes unexpected twists that demonstrate divine authorship. Iran's transformation from Israel's ally under the Shah to its greatest enemy under the Islamic Republic happened in a matter of months. The Abraham Accords realigned regional relationships almost overnight. Such dramatic reversals suggest a playwright who delights in plot developments that confound human expectations. The underground Iranian church represents another divine plot twist that human strategists could never have anticipated. The same nation being used as an instrument of persecution is simultaneously being transformed by the gospel. Millions of Iranians are turning to faith in Jesus Christ despite intense opposition from their government. The ending is being prepared even as the conflict intensifies. This prophetic perspective changes how believers should view current events. Instead of anxious worry about outcomes, there should be confident anticipation of divine purposes being fulfilled. Instead of surprise at sudden developments, there should be recognition of ancient predictions coming to pass. Instead of fear about the future, there should be excitement about witnessing history's climax. The book that was written before the battle began contains detailed descriptions of how the story ends. Jerusalem becomes the capital of the world. Former enemies worship together at the throne of Christ. Deserts blossom like gardens. Weapons are converted to farming tools. Wars cease throughout the earth. Death becomes rare and disease disappears. Between the current chapter and the final scenes, difficult passages must still be traversed. The Great Tribulation will test human faith to its limits. The Battle of Armageddon will witness unprecedented destruction. The judgment of nations will separate sheep from goats. But these dark chapters serve the larger narrative of redemption and restoration. Human actors in this drama have the illusion of free will, but they consistently choose actions that advance the predetermined plot. Iranian leaders believe they are making independent decisions about nuclear policy and regional strategy. Israeli politicians think they are responding to immediate security threats. Neither side realizes they are following a script written before the foundation of the world. The divine author allows real suspense within the framework of a certain outcome. Individual scenes may surprise even careful readers. Specific timelines remain mysterious. Secondary characters may act in unexpected ways, but the main storyline never changes. Good will triumph over evil. Light will overcome darkness. The kingdom of God will be established on earth. The call to watch and understand. Jesus stood on the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem, just days before his crucifixion, when his disciples asked the question that has echoed through the centuries. Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? His answer launched the most comprehensive prophetic discourse in Scripture, concluding with a simple but profound command: watch. This imperative to watch carries special urgency in our generation. The signs that Jesus described as harbingers of his return multiply before our eyes with unprecedented frequency. Wars and rumors of wars fill the daily news. Nations rise against nations exactly as he predicted. Earthquakes increase in frequency and intensity. Famines spread despite technological advances. False prophets deceive many with miraculous powers. Yet watching, in the biblical sense, involves far more than passive observation. The Greek word that Jesus used implies active alertness, careful attention, and intelligent analysis. It suggests the posture of a sentinel who studies the horizon for approaching armies, or a sailor who reads the sky for signs of approaching storms. Watching requires both spiritual discernment and practical wisdom. The current standoff between Iran and Israel provides a perfect case study for this kind of prophetic watching. Surface-level observation sees only political maneuvering and military posturing. Deeper analysis reveals spiritual warfare between good and evil. Prophetic watching discerns the fulfillment of ancient predictions and the approach of end-time events. Understanding begins with careful study of biblical prophecy concerning the last days. The books of Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and Revelation contain detailed descriptions of end-time scenarios that align remarkably with current Middle Eastern dynamics. Nations mentioned by name in these ancient texts correspond precisely with modern geopolitical alignments around the Iranian-Israeli conflict. But understanding requires more than academic study of prophetic passages. It demands spiritual discernment that can only come through intimate relationship with the Holy Spirit. Jesus promised that when the Spirit of truth came, he would guide believers into all truth and show them things to come. This supernatural insight enables believers to perceive divine purposes behind confusing world events. The call to watch also implies responsibility to warn others about approaching danger. Ezekiel compared the prophet to a watchman on the city wall, whose duty was to sound the alarm when enemies approached. Failure to warn the people made the watchman partially responsible for their destruction. Modern believers who understand prophetic significance bear similar responsibility to share their insights. This warning ministry requires wisdom and balance. On one hand, believers must not ignore clear signs of prophetic fulfillment, or fail to prepare spiritually for challenging times ahead. On the other hand, they must avoid date setting, sensationalism, and fear mongering that brings discredit to biblical prophecy. The goal is to encourage faith and readiness, not to create panic or paralysis. Watching and understanding also involve recognizing the difference between human speculation and biblical revelation. Many theories exist about specific timing and sequences of end time events. Some interpret prophetic symbols literally, while others see them metaphorically. Faithful watchers must distinguish between what Scripture clearly teaches and what remains uncertain or disputed. The Iranian-Israeli conflict illustrates this need for careful discernment. While the involvement of ancient Persia in end-time events seems clearly predicted, the specific role that modern Iran will play remains somewhat unclear. Faithful watchers can point to probable connections without claiming absolute certainty about details that remain hidden in divine sovereignty. Understanding prophetic significance should produce specific responses in believers' lives. Recognition that current events align with biblical predictions should deepen faith in Scripture's reliability. Awareness that Christ's return may be approaching should intensify efforts at personal holiness and evangelistic urgency. Realization that judgment is coming should motivate repentance and reconciliation. The call to watch includes watchfulness over our own spiritual condition as well as world events. Jesus warned that many would grow cold in their love during the last days. The apostles predicted that false teaching would multiply as the end approaches. Believers must guard their hearts against deception while maintaining their first love for Christ. Watching also requires practical preparation for difficult times that may lie ahead. This does not mean hoarding supplies or building bunkers, but rather strengthening spiritual foundations that can withstand testing. Believers should deepen their knowledge of Scripture, cultivate intimate prayer lives, build strong church relationships, and develop unshakable confidence in God's sovereignty. The reward for faithful watching is promised throughout Scripture. Jesus said that blessed is the servant whom his master finds watching when he returns. Paul wrote that a crown of righteousness awaits all who love Christ's appearing. The writer of Hebrews promised that Christ would appear a second time to save those who eagerly wait for him. Ultimately, the call to watch and understand is a call to hope. Current events may seem frightening when viewed from human perspective, but they become sources of encouragement when seen through prophetic lens. Every sign of approaching tribulation is simultaneously a sign of approaching redemption. Every evidence of Satan's increasing desperation is proof that his defeat draws near. The conflict between Iran and Israel may represent one of the final pieces falling into place before Christ's return. If so, believers have the incredible privilege of witnessing the climax of human history. Instead of anxiety about uncertain outcomes, there should be excitement about certain victory. The King is coming, and his kingdom will have no end, the final word, and then peace. At the end of all the analysis, beyond all the speculation, after every prophecy has been fulfilled and every battle fought, there remains one truth that transforms everything. God gets the final word. His purposes will prevail. His kingdom will come. His will shall be done on earth as it is in heaven. The story that began with "Let there be light" will conclude with "Behold, I make all things new." The conflict between Iran and Israel that captivates world attention today is merely one chapter in a much larger story. It is part of the great drama that began when Satan first rebelled against divine authority and will end when every knee bows before the throne of Christ. The missiles and threats and nuclear programs that seem so significant in our daily news will become footnotes in the eternal chronicles of God's victory over evil. From the divine perspective that sees the end from the beginning, current tensions serve purposes beyond human understanding. Iran's hostility toward Israel drives both nations toward greater dependence on divine intervention. The nuclear standoff forces world leaders to confront their own mortality and limitations. Regional chaos prepares the stage for supernatural solutions that human wisdom could never devise. Even Iran's role as an instrument of opposition serves divine purposes. The same Persian power that once enabled Jewish return from exile now creates conditions that will trigger their ultimate redemption. The nation whose leaders call for Israel's elimination will witness the most dramatic divine intervention in human history. What they intend for destruction, God will use for deliverance. The underground Iranian church provides a preview of the transformation that awaits. Millions of Iranians who were raised to hate Jews now worship a Jewish Messiah. Believers who once chanted, "Death to Israel," now pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The same hearts that were hardened by religious hatred have been softened by divine love. This spiritual revolution demonstrates that no opposition is too strong for God to overcome. The peace that will ultimately emerge from this conflict surpasses anything that human negotiators could achieve. It will not be the temporary cessation of hostilities that characterizes earthly treaties. Instead, it will be the permanent establishment of divine government that eliminates the root causes of war. When the Prince of Peace takes his throne in Jerusalem, the weapons factories will close forever. Isaiah's vision of swords beaten into plowshares will find literal fulfillment. The Iranian facilities that now enrich uranium will be converted to peaceful energy production. The Israeli defense industries will redirect their innovation toward healing and helping humanity. The military bases that train soldiers for combat will become educational centers that teach the arts of peace. The geographical transformation will be equally dramatic. Rivers will flow from Jerusalem toward both the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea. The deserts that separate Iran from Israel will bloom with unprecedented fertility. The same region that has witnessed so much bloodshed will become a garden where former enemies work together to feed the world. Most remarkably, the people themselves will be transformed. Iranian children and Israeli children will play together in streets where their parents prepared for war. Former Revolutionary Guards and Israel Defense Forces veterans will collaborate on construction projects for the Millennial Kingdom. The hatred that seemed so permanent will dissolve like morning mist before the rising sun of righteousness. The religious transformation will be complete as well. The competing claims of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity will give way to universal worship of Jesus Christ as King of Kings. The mosques of Tehran and the synagogues of Jerusalem will alike acknowledge his supreme authority. The theological disputes that fueled centuries of conflict will seem insignificant in the light of his glorious presence. This ultimate peace rests not on human promises, but on divine character. The same God who keeps covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will ensure that his word of peace is established forever. The same Christ who rose from the dead has the power to raise hope from the ashes of despair. The same Spirit who transforms individual hearts will transform entire nations. Until that day arrives, believers on both sides of the current conflict can rest in the certainty of God's sovereignty. Iranian Christians who face persecution can trust that their suffering serves eternal purposes. Israeli believers who live under threat of annihilation can rely on promises that guarantee their nation's survival. Both communities can find peace in knowing that their present trials are producing future glory. The final word belongs not to Iranian ayatollahs or Israeli prime ministers, not to American presidents or United Nations secretaries general, not to nuclear weapons or military strategies, but to the one who spoke the worlds into existence and will speak them into perfection. His kingdom will come. His will shall be done. And then at last, there will be peace. The war that was written in the Bible will end exactly as the Bible wrote it. The God who began the story will complete it according to his perfect plan. The conflict between Iran and Israel that seems so intractable today will give way to harmony that lasts forever. The Prince of Peace will reign, and of his peace there shall be no end. And then peace. Perfect peace. Everlasting peace. The peace that passes understanding because it flows from the throne of the one who is himself the source of all true peace. The war written in Scripture concludes with the peace promised in Scripture. The story that began with conflict in Eden culminates with concord in the New Jerusalem. The final word is peace, and that word stands forever.